This happened about 2 years ago. I was out for a long walk in the woods, an activity I frequently do, especially in the summertime. On this day, I'd set out early. The route I typically take is in a large woodland with many different paths that take you deeper and deeper in. This time specifically, I decided to make a bit of a change to my usual routine. I decided to walk down a bank in order to walk alongside a river. You could catch glimpses of it if you were higher up on the path, but for the most part, you could really only hear it. It was also much more remote when compared to the other paths. I had been out for 3 hours at this point. I had a book, food and drink, and a first aid kit in my bag. I'd walked far and kept walking, exploring the area. However, I couldn't help but feel uncomfortable. I tried to ignore it, but it was intense. I'm usually one for the quiet outdoors in nature, but this feeling I had kept making me look behind me to the point where I was no longer relaxed. As I got deeper into the woods, the loneliness became unnerving. I figured I was just scaring myself and tried not to play into it. That's when a cloaked figure with gloves on ran out in front of me. I instantly jumped and felt extremely alarmed. The figure had a mask on, a crow's mask, like, think a plague doctor mask. I wanted to run, and everything inside me was telling me to run, but for whatever reason, I really wanted to seem like I wasn't bothered and that the figure had failed to cause much of a reaction. So I awkwardly said, "Okay, good one. I'll be on my way now." The figure didn't say anything, rather, it began tilting its head as I walked around it and continued down the path. It was just standing there, watching me. I was extremely creeped out. Once I walked past it, I just kept walking, feeling shaken but trying not to let it show. I was nervous to look back, but eventually, I did. The creepy figure was still in the same place, still watching me walk away. He, or possibly she, gave me a wave, but not a friendly one, just a sinister one. I don't really know how to explain it, but it was slow and felt threatening. I was stupid. At this point, I felt far enough away from the figure, so I flipped at the bird, a choice I instantly regretted. The figure went from standing and waving to a full-on unhinged run in my direction. I, at this point, didn't stick around and legged it out of there. The figure was making intense, loud, and almost demonic noises as it chased me. I honestly thought I was going to die, but it all came to an end when I managed to outrun this freak and made it up onto an open footpath where I was reunited with joggers and dog walkers. I was stuck in this nervous state but still so beyond happy to see other people. I tried to make as many of them aware as I could, and the whole situation was ultimately reported. I got home safely by catching a bus into town. They were rare on that side of the county, but I managed, thankfully. I felt lucky yet really detached and uncomfortable. The area was investigated by police, but it was so deep in the woods, I don't know how much they covered. As of yet, nothing has been reported since, and nobody nor anything has been found. I now avoid that area and don't plan on going too far off the beaten track on my own again. I still think about this experience. It's still vivid in my mind and absolutely terrifying to me. This happened years ago when I was 20. Back then, I was good friends with a guy named Ethan, who I met in high school. Both of us grew up with a passion for the outdoors, and so we thought it'd be fun to go on a week-long backpacking trip in the California woods together. We've done this once before, and I really enjoyed it. I remember looking forward to it. The whole trip started off going well, but that only lasted till the second night. It was just starting to get dark, and Ethan and I were setting up our tents for the night when we began to hear the distant sound of leaves crunching under multiple pairs of footsteps. We were pretty deep in the forest, but running into other campers wasn't completely unheard of, just, I guess, a bit of a rare occurrence. Eventually, 3 guys came into view. They didn't really look like campers. They didn't have backpacks or anything. I thought it was kind of weird to be wandering around the forest this late, but I didn't think much of it. They gave us a somewhat friendly greeting, and we gave one back. They then asked us if we were camping for the night, which was obvious as we were in the process of setting up our tents with the rest of our stuff all laid out. We pointedly said yes and asked if that was a problem. We wanted to make sure we weren't on someone's private property or, just generally in a place we weren't supposed to be. They replied saying no and just kind of walked off. The whole encounter was odd, but Ethan didn't think so. He pointed out how they were most likely just hunters in the area, as all of them were armed, something I myself didn't notice. Got to a few hours later, and Ethan and I were now asleep in our respective tents. This was around the time I woke up to the sound of yelling, like multiple voices shouting in the distance. I yelled out to Ethan to see if he was awake. He was and was just as confused as I was. It was 2 a.m. when this happened. Our conversation was then interrupted by multiple gunshots. They honestly sounded like they were getting closer. I asked Ethan if he thought that whoever these people were just hunting. He responded, saying, "No, dude, there's no way they're hunting this late. I think we should go." My heart started to race, now realizing the reality of the situation we were in. We both unzipped our tents, grabbed only our bare necessities, and started hastily moving west. We moved for maybe half an hour before stopping. The yelling and gunshots were now barely audible, although they were persistent, continuing off and on up until sunrise. All night, we basically just sat there, listening to them, both wide awake from a mixture of fear and adrenaline. When the sun finally rose, we discussed what to do next. Ultimately, we decided we would wait until noon before heading back to our campsite. The plan was to then quickly pack up all of our stuff and make the trek back to our cars, cutting our trip 5 days short. Fast forward to noon, and we started cautiously heading back. When we arrived, the sight we were met with was nothing short of horrifying. Our campsite had been completely ransacked. Almost all of our stuff had been damaged. This is thousands of dollars in equipment we're talking about. But most disturbing were the bullet holes shot into our tents. You don't have to be that smart to conclude that these people had genuinely tried to kill us. Further supporting this theory is the fact that nothing was actually stolen from our campsite, it was all just damaged. As far as who did this, we don't know. The only people we can really pin as suspects are the 3 people that walked up to us as we were building our tents. But this begs the question, why? Why would they do this? The whole experience has left us with more questions than answers. Nothing about it makes much sense, but I know I myself just feel lucky to be alive. In the end, we quickly salvaged all the equipment we could and made the trek back to our cars. Nowadays, I don't camp nearly as much as I used to. I'm 24, and ever since I was young, I've been into hiking. Now, I get hiking isn't all that appealing to most people, but because of where I live, it's pretty easy to get into. You don't have to travel all that far for a pretty stunning scenic view. I try to find a new trail to hike every weekend. Typically, I'll hike alone, so I always keep a knife in my backpack for protection against wildlife. Should it ever come to that, though, in all my years of hiking, I've never once had to actually use it. In fact, I've never run into any dangerous situation while hiking. Well, at least up until a few days ago. I was driving to a heavily forested hiking trail I'd never been to before. Now, I hike in the afternoon, and this happened around the time of year where the days were starting to get shorter. In other words, the sun was setting earlier and earlier each day. This was a key detail that I had completely forgotten about prior to leaving. Only after I started driving to the place did I realize it would be completely dark outside before I would even be able to finish my hike. A decision I still regret making is deciding to do the hike anyway. I got a bad feeling about it right when I started. Fast forward a few hours, and I was now about 85% finished with the route I picked out. By this point, it was almost completely dark. I had a flashlight, but still, the whole scene was pretty eerie. This portion of the trail was deep in the forest. It was so dense with trees that the moonlight could barely even find its way through. Don't get me wrong, it was beautiful scenery in the day, but alone at night, it was nothing short of disturbing. It was then that I was really starting to regret my decision to carry out the hike. That's when I saw light up ahead on the trail. As soon as I shined my flashlight in its direction, it immediately got turned off. I didn't know what it was, but I couldn't exactly turn back, so I was pretty much forced to go directly towards where it had been. In the back of my mind, I knew the chances of it being another hiker in the dark were slim to none. Eventually, I reached where the light came from. There was no one. Instead, there was a large duffel bag lying on the ground. I began scanning the trees with my flashlight. That's when a large, probably 6.5-foot man stepped out from behind one of the trees. My body completely froze up. There I stood, like a deer in headlights, shining my light on the guy. He then slowly revealed a machete from behind his back. Seeing this, I started running for my life down the trail and in the direction of my car. I looked behind me, and the guy was chasing me. I dropped my backpack so I could run faster. When I finally reached a clearing in the forest and could see my car, I was still sprinting. I grabbed my keys from my pocket and unlocked it. I got inside, locked the doors, and had the engine on in less than 5 seconds. However, the guy was still behind me and was able to completely slash one of my back tires before I could drive off. I drove on an almost completely flat tire for the next 5 miles back to my house. Right as I pulled into my driveway, I called the police and reported the man. Although I have no idea if he was found, quite frankly, I have no idea if the police even searched for him. A part of me wants to go back to retrieve my backpack, which contains hundreds of dollars in equipment, but there's no way I can bring myself to do it. Plus, there's no guarantee it's still even there. For all I know, the guy went back and took it. I still don't know what I stumbled upon that night. This was by far the scariest experience I've ever had and the closest I've ever felt to death. In 2014, a man named Blair and his wife Farah were spending a weekend together on Vancouver Island, which they had done many times before. The couple has a lot of experience on the island and just camping in general. Vancouver Island provides an optimal camping setting because of its mix of scenic beaches and dense forest. The couple had many successful camping trips on the island until something truly terrifying happened to them on their final outing on the island. Blair and Farah were far from any roads or civilization, enjoying the solitude. They set up camp on a beach, a good distance from anywhere, and kept a fire going. To get to the trail leaving the beach was 1 kilometer along the beach and 2 kilometers to the road through the forest. The couple had met another camper named Claude from New Zealand, who they ran into earlier that day on the beach. Claude was planning on sleeping in his van, which he parked back up on the road. The couple invited him down to the beach for a fire, and the three shared a bottle of wine, talking amongst themselves around the fire. This is where things started to get a little creepy. The sun was starting to go down by this point, and the trio kept hearing what sounded like female voices from behind them in the bushes dividing the beach from the forest. It wasn't too dark out yet, though, so it was still possible that they were just other hikers or campers nearby, or even a group who anchored offshore and the sound was just bouncing in a weird way. All three of them could agree that they were hearing female voices. On that note, it was getting late and a little dark, so Claude said goodbye and set out to hike back to his car before it was too dark. Blair and Farah stayed by their campsite and stoked the fire because Farah was starting to get creeped out by the voices, which continued on into the darkness. It sounded like two female voices speaking, but whatever that was being said was unintelligible. It sounded to the couple like the voices were not far beyond the tree line now. They stayed up very late tending to the fire, and only when the voices had finally stopped did they decide to put out the fire and go to sleep in the tent. Before doing so, the two had scanned the cove with a flashlight several times looking for boats that could have been the source of the talking, but there was nothing in sight. It was around 3 a.m. when they laid down, finally ready to catch some sleep, but about 15 minutes after they laid down, Blair and Farah heard footsteps in the area around their campsite, over by where the fire was. They came from the direction of the bushes toward the inland behind them, a direction that was not traversable by people. The couple lay there hoping it was just a bear or any animal, because the only bears on the island are black bears, which usually are very timid around people. The footsteps went from the fire, then over to the tent, then back into the woods. 5 minutes later, the footsteps came back again to the fire, and now, clear as day, there were two female voices talking gibberish very loudly. Their communication did not resemble any languages known to Blair or Farah, and they seemed to be talking over each other, having what could barely be considered a conversation at full volume in the dead of night, very far away from civilization, without using lights to navigate through the dense brush relatively quietly in a direction that seemed impossible to traverse on foot. The two voices moved from the fire pit area over to the tent, still talking at a loud volume. They stood over the tent talking for a few seconds, then went completely dead silent. They went back into the woods to never be seen or heard again. Blair and Farah lay there completely frozen and afraid for a long time. They woke up around 11 a.m. the next day because of how late they fell asleep. They packed up first thing and never returned. The couple probably made the best decision to remain quiet in the tent, not drawing attention to themselves from whoever or whatever was outside. The following pictures you're about to see were taken by hikers Orly and Dante, who both live in Eagle Mountain, Utah, a small town south of Salt Lake City. For the past few years, they had been exploring forests in search of interesting things, and one day they found it. One day, Orly was hiking in Cedar Fort, just 5 miles south of Salt Lake City. While hiking, she found large amounts of animal bones and piles of junk people had dumped, but things started to get strange when she started coming across strange symbols and animal parts scattered throughout the forest, some of them in weird formations. On September 15th, she decided to bring her friend Dante along with her to show him in person the unusual things she was finding. This time, the two came across something even more disturbing. On the trail, there was a severed deer head and a pentagram surrounded by deer legs, which were not there the first time Orly walked the trail. The sun was going down, and after getting their pictures, they agreed it was time to head back to the car. But the more they walked, they realized they didn't recognize the path they were on. So, the two started looking around for anything that could refresh their memory of where they were. But as it got dark out, the two accepted that they were lost. With nothing but their phone flashlights to navigate, they started getting the feeling they were being watched. As they picked up their pace, the two started to hear the trees and bushes moving at least 20 feet to their right, made more concerning by the fact that there was no wind that night. The two started to panic and hurried onto a trail they found, hoping it would take them back to Orly's car. Just when things couldn't seem to get any worse, Orly and Dante heard a scream so deep and horrific that it sounded neither human nor animal. The two sprinted down the trail, Orly making a conscious effort not to look back, but Dante did. Dante claimed to see a large black figure on the trail behind them, too big to be a human. The two made it to the car by some stroke of luck, losing whatever was chasing them. So, they left the forest and went straight home. Orly has not returned since. Enzo is an avid hiker who in 2016 was visiting his brother in upstate New York near Downsville. Enzo's brother owns a small house and a barn up there, and from time to time, Enzo and other family members would go up to visit. This was in the late fall, and so the foliage was already mostly orange and more than half of the leaves had fallen off the trees. Enzo was hiking a narrow trail which was not far from his brother's place. This trail is in the middle of a very rural area and it connects from the occasional property to property. So when Enzo stumbled across a duffel bag on the ground in the middle of the woods, it was a surprise. The duffel bag looked like it was relatively new. It didn't look dirty as if it had been sitting in the woods for an extended period of time. There was a foul odor emanating from the bag, however, like something rotting inside. Enzo assumed the worst, but he knew he had to open the bag to see what was inside in case it actually could have been a person. He was building up the courage to open the zipper to the bag, but before he could, he heard footsteps approaching from off the trail and a voice saying, "That's mine, please don't touch it." A large man in a dirty jacket and jeans was quickly approaching from the woods and grabbed the duffel bag off the ground. The two exchanged looks for a moment. Enzo told the man he assumed the bag was forgotten by someone, and the man told him he was storing his kill from his hunt in the bag. Even though Enzo isn't a hunter, he knew it's standard to use a cooler for storing fresh kill, not a duffel bag of all things. This also wouldn't explain the foul smell so soon, as usually dead bodies only start to smell after a few days, not right after death. So he apologized and continued walking down the trail with a little more speed in his step. It's likely the man noticed Enzo's nervousness because he heard the duffel bag get dropped on the floor as he was walking away, but as he looked back, he didn't see the man anymore. Enzo nervously continued along the trail, taking out his phone to try to call his brother for an emergency pickup by the road, but he didn't have any reception in the woods. All he could do was press forward and avoid crossing paths with that man again. But as he continued on, he kept hearing leaves crunching from not far behind him, and any time he'd look back, the coast seemed clear. Eventually, his fear that he was being followed became real. He saw that man following him in the distance in a stalkerish manner, hiding behind a tree. Without thinking, Enzo started to run as fast as he could down the trail. He knew he was being followed without even looking back because he could hear the leaves being crushed not too far behind him. Enzo came to an abandoned-looking property with overgrown grass, and having grown too winded to continue running, he attempted entry to the old house through the back door and was able to get inside. Enzo hid under a cot in the first bedroom he found, and he heard the back door open again, followed by heavy footsteps moving in a hurry. They went from room to room, and Enzo could hear the man's heavy breathing from also being out of breath. The man's footsteps came into the bedroom just for a second and left right after. He didn't look under either of the two cots. Enzo heard the back door to the house open and slam shut again, but he laid under the cot for another half an hour, not taking any risks. He only got up when he realized it would be dark soon and he needed to get to a road to call for help. He proceeded to leave the house and run down the dirt trail by the house that was most likely once used as a driveway, which led him to a road. From there, he eventually hitched a ride with a passing car who gave Enzo a lift back to his brother's house, where Enzo would call the local police department and report his encounter. Given the severity of the case, police showed up at the house to get a more detailed description of the man's face, the location it happened, and other information. Though it was never technically confirmed what was in that duffel bag, the rotting smell would already be clue enough. But the fact that the man so intently chased after Enzo shows that he was hiding something that he didn't want any witnesses for, most likely dumping a dead body all. Tale takes us deep into the darkest corners of the internet, where whispers of a cursed game spread like wildfire through online forums and chat rooms. They called it the Grimoire, a text-based role-playing game shrouded in mystery and whispered rumors of misfortune and despair. Legend had it that the game was the creation of a reclusive programmer, a digital recluse who had poured his darkest fears and obsessions into its code. But something went wrong. The game, once intended as harmless entertainment, became corrupted, twisted by an unknown force, its code taking on a life of its own. Rumors spread like wildfire through the online gaming community, tales of players experiencing strange phenomena, their real lives mirroring the events of the game with chilling accuracy. Some claimed to have lost fortunes, their in-game losses translating into real-world financial ruin. Others whispered of broken relationships, accidents, even disappearances, all linked to the game's malevolent influence. The game, it seemed, had a way of reaching out from the screen, of blurring the lines between the virtual and the real with terrifying consequences. Despite the chilling tales, curiosity got the better of many, drawn to the game's mystique like moths to a flame. Among them were two friends, Mark and Lucas, avid gamers with a penchant for the strange and unusual. They stumbled upon the Grimoire on a hidden forum, its download link buried beneath layers of cryptic messages and warnings. Intrigued and perhaps a little foolish, they decided to download the game, eager to experience its mysteries firsthand. As they installed the game, a sense of unease settled over them, the computer screen flickering erratically, the room growing noticeably colder. Ignoring the warning signs, they launched the game, its opening screen a jumble of distorted text and disturbing imagery that seemed to writhe and pulsate before their eyes. A single line of text appeared on the screen, its message chilling in its simplicity: "Welcome to the Grimoire. You have been warned." Undeterred, Mark and Lucas created their characters, their avatars appearing on the screen as pixelated representations of themselves, their features strangely distorted, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The game world was a dark and unforgiving place, a labyrinth of shadowy forests and crumbling ruins populated by grotesque creatures and malevolent entities. As they progressed through the game, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, their every move scrutinized by an unseen presence. Strange things began to happen. This is something that happened to me when I was much younger. I believe I was about 11 or 12 during this time. I lived at home with my older brother and my parents. One of my favorite things to do after school most days was to unwind by playing some video games. I would go upstairs to my bedroom and start playing on my PlayStation 2 for a while. Sometimes, I would play all the way until it was time for dinner. So, one day I got home from school and went straight up to my bedroom to play some video games. Both my parents were still at work, and my brother was still at school. That's how things usually were for an hour or two after I got back on most days. I remember playing video games, and a little while in, I heard my brother getting home downstairs. The front door opened and closed, and I heard him walk inside. I thought nothing of it and I kept gaming. But about an hour later, I got a call from my mom. I had a home phone in my bedroom and saw through the caller ID that it was my mom's cell phone. When I answered, she told me that she was on her way to pick up my brother from his friend's house, and they would be home soon. My dad was going to pick up some food on the way home from work, and she wanted to know what I wanted. I told her whatever food it was that I was in the mood for that night. Then we said bye, and I hung up. It was only after ending the call that I realized it was strange that my brother was not home. If he was at a friend's house, then who had I heard entering our house? My heart started racing, and I had a terrible feeling. I carefully walked to my bedroom door and opened it up. I had never heard the person walking upstairs or near my bedroom. I didn't know where they went after entering the house. So, after not hearing or seeing anything, I left my bedroom. I quietly walked down the hallway and looked downstairs. I still saw nothing. Then I went down the stairs. Once there, I walked around the main level of the house looking. I did not see anybody, but when I was near the kitchen and kind of the front door, I heard a noise coming from the basement. It sounded like somebody was down there. I quickly ran away and went back upstairs to my bedroom. A short time after entering my room, I heard the front door to the house open and close again. At that point, I ran back downstairs. When I got to the front door, I saw what looked like a man walking away down the street. I didn't recognize him and only saw him for like 2 seconds. It might not have been the same guy who had been in the house, but I think it was. I then locked all the doors and called my parents, who then called the police. The door had been left unlocked for when my brother got home. I hadn't known he was going to a friend's house. Looking back, I can't believe it happened. I didn't even know I was home alone with some random guy downstairs. I'm really glad that he didn't go near my bedroom. Out of all my strange experiences, this is probably the most compelling I had simply because I was not alone when it happened. I was not with just the average kind of people either. I'll put in as much detail exactly as I remembered them, so this may be long. I can't mention the name of the company I work for to protect my job, but it's one of the largest telcos in the Philippines, which is synonymous with the word world. I currently work as one of the senior IT network and server engineers there. I usually get assigned to work on priority repairs on various cell sites and server data centers, mostly in far-flung provinces. This happened in mid-December of 2018 in Nueva Vizcaya, a mountainous province in the northern region of the Philippines. It was a priority service call, Sera T1, the highest of priorities, wherein even the CEO of the company received status updates since the cell site in question also services various military communications devices. As soon as I got into the office, I was dispatched immediately, carrying with me various equipment to replace the existing ones at the cell site. It was a 6-hour drive from Manila. I was asked to go to a specific meeting point in the town nearest the cell site to rendezvous with my escort, an 8-member team from the Philippines 1st Army Scout Ranger Regiment. The area of the cell site is a place where the local communist movement, the New People's Army, is highly active. Apparently, the NPA carried out an operation early in the morning of that day, which caused some of the damage to the equipment. The team I met up with was led by one of my former high school classmates. Let's call him Lieutenant Knox. He had even specifically asked for me as he knew I worked for the telco. He had his men transfer the equipment to their truck, and we began to travel to the cell site. It was already dark at the time. During the long uphill ride, Lieutenant Knox and I did some catching up when they suddenly received a call. I don't understand military speak, so I could not tell exactly what we talked about, but he updated us accordingly, saying that a village on the way to the cell site requested assistance with a possible NPA member harassing a household. Apparently, the man had climbed up on the roof of someone's house, and he was still in the area. Being the nearest, Lieutenant Knox responded that his team would be handling it, so we drove towards the area, keeping the headlights turned off. The countryside, especially the poorer places, are very dark. Soldiers aren't allowed to smoke at night in places like these since the light from their cigarettes could be clearly seen even from afar, giving away their position. It was that dark here. I was hesitant since I'm not exactly a soldier, but he brushed it off, saying it would be a good chance for me to become a soldier for at least one night. Lieutenant Knox, I can say, is a battle-hardened junior officer. He's been to a number of dangerous situations and has fought in many encounters, both high-profile and low-key. He's the type of guy to jump in quickly then ask questions later. I remember him being like that even in school, a very cocky individual but not entirely without cause, especially now that he was in the army. He even received a medal recently, although I wasn't sure for what. Either way, he said, we're going in. It's part of the job. Now, you have to understand the Philippine Army usually does the police work in these areas where communists, Muslim insurgents, or bandits are active. And when you send in the scouts, the best our military has to offer, you can get an idea of the kind of situation it places in. Even other countries recognized the abilities of the Philippine Scout Rangers, all the more so in this case since these scouts came from the 1st Regiment. They're the best the scouts have to offer, from what I was made to understand. We got to the place a little over 5 minutes after, with me still having second thoughts. Dude, make up your mind. Either you shadow me or I leave you in the truck. But if you stay here, you're gonna be free dinner for the commies. Can't spare you a babysitter for this one, he explained to me. So he made the choice easier for me. I didn't have plans to be abducted. I was already soiling myself, basically not cut out for this stuff. I just wanted to repair the cell site and go home, but I did have plans to get his wife to get back at him for this. Here, he said, handing me a loaded 9mm and 2 clips. I know you're used to this one, and the safety's on. I sat there thinking I wasn't getting paid enough for this job, and I recalled my company insurance policy. It doesn't even cover sports-related injuries, let alone anything you'd see in a firefight. But I didn't have time to dilly-dally, so I stuck with my friend instead of waiting for someone to drag me into the woods and getting held for ransom, which no one's gonna pay for, let's face it. The plan was for 6 of his men to break off into 3 pairs to surround the house in question. Me, Knox, and his sniper Mason were to head over to the water tower about 60 meters out. I guess he planned to snipe the guy and have his men stand by on the ground in case the sniper missed. As we trekked over to the water tower, he told me, "You're too stiff, man. You're wearing dark clothes. No one's gonna see you. We'll be in and out in 10 minutes. You're a VIP, and that's why I came and had my sergeant stay with the platoon at the cell site, so don't worry so much." I didn't know VIPs had to join in responding to calls like this, but the scouts were undermanned as it was already, and that's why my friend needed to multitask at the moment. When we got to the water tower, Private First Class Mason immediately positioned himself, and Lieutenant Knox sat beside him while I positioned myself behind. At that time, I was thinking to myself, well, yeah, this wasn't so bad. I'm far and safe away from that area. But then I heard Mason say, "Sir, you need to see this." Knox brought out some type of binoculars, I guess they call it an NV scope. I couldn't see his reaction because it was dark, but he was silent for a moment as he put down the binoculars. "What in the world?" was all Knox could whisper. He then turned to me and asked me to look at the direction he pointed and to tell him what I saw. I was initially concerned, thinking that there were more NPAs now and that we were outnumbered. A reaction like this from a seasoned scout didn't exactly paint a nice picture in my mind. But what I saw was definitely something that will probably haunt me for the rest of my life. I wish I hadn't taken those binoculars at all. I even wish I saw more communists instead of what I did see. The image was green, and I saw someone on the roof of a house. It was a man. He didn't have a shirt on, nor did he have any weapons on him. He had very short hair or a shaved head, and he was barefoot. He had jeans on, but the lower part was wrapped from what I could tell. He had dark skin and seemed normal at first glance, but then I noticed his arms, which were very, very long. His hands were almost past his knees, and his fingers were also very long and pointed. The fingers were longer than normal and had tips that looked like long nails or even claws. The first thing on my mind was, this can't be real. "Sir," Mason said, "it's moving." I didn't expect what happened next. The thing, whatever it really was, looked right at our group. Even from that distance, it was unmistakable. He or it had its head turned in our direction, and its eyes were solid white. Eye shine, like a cat's eyes. Right then, I nearly dropped the binoculars. Had it not been strapped to my wrist, it probably would have fallen straight through the grated flooring of the water tower. Knox looked to me as if asking what I saw, and all I could say was, "It looked at us, man. It knows we're up here." Almost at the same time, Mason begged, "Sir, your orders." My friend gave the order to put 2 in its head. I think the first shot hit the mark because we heard a scream echo throughout the valley. It sounded like a mix of a high-pitched male screaming and a cornered animal crying out in pain. I'm not sure how to describe it beyond that, but it was the first time I'd ever heard such a sound. I'm sure all of us heard it because of how loud the sound was. Mason never let out a second shot. I don't know if he did so on purpose or if he was caught off guard, but we then heard automatic rifle shots in the distance. Knox immediately told us to go. Mason went down the ladder first at a ridiculous rate, then me, then Knox. Back on the ground, we ran over to the house. These guys were fast and easily outran me. Knox had to basically drag me along the way so I wouldn't be left behind. Honestly, I was reluctant to run where we were headed. I wasn't as hardcore as these scouts. I could barely even keep myself from soiling myself. There was still someone firing in the direction towards the tree line. When we got to the house, near the front, we found one of the soldiers sitting against the wall. His buddies seemed to be applying first aid. His left forearm had a long and nasty gash that leaked fiercely onto the soil. I wanted to vomit. He reported to Knox that something jumped up from the roof and landed right on top of him. It was just after Mason fired. While he didn't get a good look at the attacker due to the darkness, he specifically refused to call it human. Even his buddy didn't think it was human at all. The other 4 soldiers got back to us, saying that the assailant got away. Knox decided to get to know the people in the house, and we found out that a young couple lived there. In fact, the woman was 7 months pregnant. They had texted their local village official, saying that the assailant was 7 months pregnant. who in turn requested the military to check since, again, they suspected it was an NPA. The three of us, Knox, Mason, and me, never told anyone, even the couple, what we saw that night. We simply stated it was a machete-swinging communist trying to rob the couple. After all, the NPAs were known to resort to banditry. A while after that, we finally made our way to the cell site. I simply couldn't stop shaking. When we got there, I immediately got to doing my necessary repairs. Knox and Mason stuck to their story when the rest of their platoon asked about it regarding the recent encounter. They never mentioned anything about the man's description or the strange animal sound. After working an all-nighter and making sure the cell site was operational, Knox and his men, minus the injured one, took me back to the town where I had parked my car as soon as daybreak came. As his men loaded the damaged equipment I replaced into my car, Knox talked to me. At first, he was trying to joke around, saying I could probably enlist in the regular army now since I had some first-hand experience. I went along with this for a moment, hoping to forget about the strange incident. But inside, I was utterly horrified. However, before I was able to drive away, Knox said to me, "Dude, Mason, we saw the same thing you did. You know what it was, don't you?" I never responded, but inside, I think I knew what he was talking about. The aswang, a mythical creature from Filipino folklore, the stuff of a Filipino child's nightmares. The description, the sound, it was the only thing that made sense explaining what the thing was during the Spanish era from the 1500s to 1890. These creatures were said to be once human who were supposedly blessed by the moon priestesses of old called Baba Even, so that the people could have the power to fight the Spanish colonizer who had done them wrong. It is said that the Spaniards decided to persecute these priestesses for witchcraft, then spread tales that aswangs attacked locals and foreigners alike. The aswang is a creature said to be able to shape-shift into either a human or an animal, but it is never able to correctly imitate one or the other. As a human, it has leathery black skin and disproportionate limbs. As an animal, like a cat or dog, it is always black and 3 times the normal size. It can neither speak nor do animal calls. It can only grouch out or scream. They usually eat the flesh of recently deceased humans and animals, but have a strange preference for the ill or pregnant women. Pregnant women like the one in the village. They can never become human again, and being in a swang is hereditary. No one will turn if attacked by one, although the wounds they inflict are often fatal. This is what Knox and I were both thinking, but I'd always considered it just that, just folklore. Yet there's no denying that what we saw that night wasn't human. I have never been back to the general area after, while Knox and his team had been dispatched to the south dealing with ISIS members. Before I posted this, I asked them about that night. It's hard to imagine a soldier of his caliber believing in such tales. I find it even harder as I write this to believe what I saw was real. But no matter how hard I try to come up with an explanation, I couldn't, except for the idea that it truly was an aswang, the legend passed down by our forefathers. Knox said to me in reply, "I told you before, you and I both know what the thing was." I go with what I see, and most of the time, I don't have the luxury of time to doubt whatever is in front of me. I don't know if I'll ever know the truth, and I can't be sure if I even want to know. I served in the U.S. military, in the Marines, for 7 years, and I've been deployed overseas for 2 tours, each lasting 3 to 4 months, during 2003 and 2004 in Afghanistan. During my second tour in 2004, I remember it was August during a hot summer night in the desert. We were heading back to camp and driving in 2 separate jeeps. One of the privates, Mika was his name, leaned over from the back seat and said to me, "Hey sir, can you let off the AC a little bit?" I replied to him, "Private Mika, the AC is on setting 2 out of 5. We're almost to camp, so just hang in there." Another private, by the name of Noah, who was sitting in the passenger seat, said, "Sir, I'm freezing. It feels like we're in Alaska." I replied, "Privates, I don't feel this cold you're talking about." To make my squad happy, I went ahead and turned off the AC in the Jeep, even though I knew it was going to be a hot 4 miles ahead until we got back to base. I looked over to Private Noah and asked, "You feel better?" But I was cut off from completing my sentence when Orion said over the walkie-talkie, "Sarge, confirmed visual of an enemy sniper in the church tower window." I immediately replied, "How sure are you? This place was secured 4 months ago." I grabbed a pair of binoculars and looked into the church tower, and suddenly my stomach began to turn when I saw that the lookout was not lying. I quickly ordered both jeeps to turn behind the building so that the sniper could not see the squad inside his scope. I yelled to Orion from my walkie, "I need you to take a shot, keep it silenced. If there's one in the tower, who knows how many else there are." Several moments passed before Orion took the shot and replied in the walkie, "Sarge, we have a direct hit, the sniper is down." I was relieved because this sort of situation, if left unmanaged, could be deadly for us or a future squad in the region. But then a few moments later, Orion was back on the walkie. "Scratch that, sir. He's back in the window and sir, he looks like he's laughing." I grabbed my walkie and angrily replied, "So keep shooting, take him down, roger that, sir." And a few more minutes went by when Officer Orion responded, "8 rounds fired, sir. Sniper appears to be down." We proceeded to drive our jeeps down the outskirts of the city, heading cautiously towards the church tower where the sniper had been spotted. We first cleared the buildings around the tower to make sure he wasn't alone, but apparently, he was. We found nothing but broken glass and furniture that was destroyed, and chunks of walls that were on the floor of the buildings. We finally walked toward the church tower. I slowly led the crew up inside the building. The basement level was the chapel, which was empty, nothing but destroyed pews and a knocked-over podium by the stage. I had 3/4 of the guys stay on the bottom level, and the rest went up with me to confirm Orion's kill. But as we ascended the stairwell, it felt insanely cold, and it only grew colder the further up we got. Did this church have functioning air conditioning? How in the world was it this cold in here? I was wondering as I began to reach the top. A sudden stench hit my nose and made my stomach sink, the smell of rot and decay. I poked my head around the corner slowly, weapon drawn and pointed out. I wanted to turn around so bad, but I knew that I had to complete my task. That room was clear, but I needed to head upwards. The body had to be found. When I reached the attic, I didn't find a body, but I did find broken glass from the window where the shots had come through. I spoke in the walkie-talkie and said that it could not be confirmed, thinking that the guy had escaped or he had been in a group and they had already left the proximity. Orion soon spoke up through the walkie and said, "You've got to be kidding me, sir." I saw him go down on the 3rd shot. I was startled to see something written on the wall. In Arabic, the text was dark red, and to be honest with you, at first, I thought it was blood. I had to remind myself that this wasn't some horror film. I'd seen that lettering before, and I was more than sure what it said, home. My nerves were trembling at this point. I couldn't take it anymore and ran downstairs. After reporting this to my commanding officer, he hated the sound of it. He said that he didn't want us to come back until the soldier was captured or executed. I said, "Sir, yes sir," and we stayed all night looking for him. I did not mention what I saw upstairs to anyone in my squad because I didn't want to scare them. I was already a bit spooked, but even after another squad joined us as backup, we never found a trace of the sniper we'd seen. Long after the failure to locate this sniper, we never had to go back to that church or town, for that matter, and I was extremely thankful for that. But that doesn't mean it didn't stay in my head for a long time. We saw someone in that attic. We shot him around 8 times. We felt that chilling cold. It was impossible for it to be that cold out there. And the red word on the wall that said home, was it this ghost sniper's plea of what he wanted, or was it a warning for us to get away? I'll never know for sure. This story did not personally happen to me, but it happened to my father. It takes place approximately 3 years ago near the Stones River battlefield in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. My parents are divorced, and my dad lives in an apartment with a roommate. At the time, my dad was a truck driver. On this particular night, he was driving back home, driving along Stones River battlefield, which was a battlefield during the Civil War. My dad is a history buff, and he often took me and my siblings there since it was a spot he enjoyed visiting. On this night, however, it changed his perspective about this historical landmark. As my dad drove down the road, he saw a group of people waiting to cross the street. But as he got closer, he realized that this group of people were all dressed as Civil War soldiers. My dad's initial thought, of course, was that they were reenactors, not giving any thought as to why they were doing a reenactment this late at night. Maybe they were practicing. He didn't know for sure and didn't even think about it. When my dad approached, he stopped his truck and let them cross the street. But what he saw next terrified him greatly. One of the soldiers had stopped and looked at my dad with cold black eyes and a ghostly pale face. My dad was spooked and just sat there in shock until the soldiers had crossed the street and disappeared like mist on the wind. My father drove the rest of the way home, trying to piece it together and keep his sanity intact. He had no idea what he had just witnessed. He then told me some things that had happened after that, things that scare me more than anything. He told me as he got home, he was video chatting with someone on Skype, and at one point in the night, he got up to go do something, so he left his room. When he returned, the person he was chatting with on the video call asked him something strange. They asked, "Was the person walking around in your kitchen your roommate?" My dad's roommate was gone for the night, and my dad's apartment is very small, so if someone had broken in, they wouldn't be hard to find. My dad began to freak out, immediately thinking that one of the ghost soldiers he saw had followed him home. For the longest time, my dad wasn't a believer in the paranormal, not until this experience. He even discovered that around that area and the battlefield, there were common ghost sightings. So just remember, if you're ever driving by the Stones River battlefield, be careful, as these spirits may follow you back to your place, and they may not be as tame as the ones that followed my father. It was a Memorial Day weekend, so my friend group rented a lakefront house for the weekend 3 hours away from home. It was cheap because it was in the middle of nowhere in North Carolina. It was Callista, Cara, Zelda, Mia, Cheryl, and myself. We all piled into Cheryl's truck. I was the one to find this place on Airbnb, and what was most appealing about it was the big deck with the hot tub on it that overlooked the lake. There was also a fire pit right by the water with a bunch of Adirondack chairs around it. Everything about it seemed perfect for a few days and nights of getting wasted with some friends. The Airbnb host told me that when we got to the property, there was a hidden key behind the mailbox to unlock the front driveway gate. The driveway was made of gravel and dirt, and it cut through a small opening in the woods, bringing a slight uphill to a bigger opening where the house was. Cheryl parked the truck right next to the front deck. The deck wrapped around the entire house, which was pretty cool. The first thing I did was walk to the back part of the deck and look at the view of the lake. It was very beautiful and peaceful. Too bad we were about to be blasting music and partying. Right as we were done unpacking, everyone cracked open beers, and we wasted no time letting the weekend begin. We played beer pong, cornhole, barbecued, and blasted music for hours. We were really loud because, as far as we knew, this was the only house around here. It's not like there were any nearby neighbors to complain. The phone connection out there was very spotty, so we really were just living in the moment, socializing with each other, not distracted by social media and whatnot. As it was getting darker and we were sitting by the fire pit, we all got startled when a voice came from the edge of the woods. It was some middle-aged woman with short hair. She started yelling at us to lower the music, so someone lowered the volume of the music. The woman started more or less lecturing us, saying how we out-of-towners always come here, litter in the lake, and create nothing but noise. She seemed like genuine white trash. I apologized on behalf of all of us, and one of the girls asked the woman if she lived nearby and if she could hear the music. The woman responded, still in a yell, that she couldn't even hear herself think. She didn't acknowledge the other question regarding if she lived nearby. Then, she just walked away into the woods, like literally into the dark woods. It was so strange. When we were sure she was out of earshot, we all erupted into laughter. As bizarre as the encounter was, we had to make light of it, but it also did put a slight damper on things considering we thought for sure we were far enough away from any neighboring houses to blast music and be loud. But we continued to drink, and pretty soon that concern was forgotten about, and we got loud again. Some immeasurable amount of time passed before a song ended, and it went quiet for a second, and we heard a voice calling out from the lake. We paused the music and listened, and sure enough, a voice was calling out for help in the middle of the lake. We all looked at each other nervously. I stood up and went to the water and yelled out, "Who's out there? Are you in the water?" The voice called back, "Yes, help." Adrenaline started to kick in. There was a kayak leaned up against the deck by the water with 2 sets of paddles. Cheryl and I agreed to paddle out there in an effort to save whoever was out there. We yelled out at them to keep calling out, but as we got in the water, the calls seemed to get further away no matter how deep we got into the lake. After like 5 to 10 minutes of rowing out to the complete darkness of this lake, calling out repeatedly for that man, we heard it was just utter silence. All we could see were the lights from the house sitting at the edge of the lake, and then just darkness in every other direction. It was only the sound of the light splashes of water and then screams, female screams, coming from the direction of the house. They sounded gut-wrenching, like genuine screams of danger. It sounded like more than one, at least 2 of the girls' screams. We immediately started paddling back, even more panicked now. The screams stopped long before we got back to the shore. We screamed out for our friends, but we checked inside and outside of the cabin, and all 4 of them were gone, vanished without a trace. We tried texting and calling them, but we had no bars, of course. Cheryl's truck was still there, so we took it and drove up the road looking for the nearest neighboring house. We found it, a similar opening in the woods that led up a hill and onto a property where we saw a house with the lights on. We went to ring the doorbell multiple times, but no one ever answered. We went to look through one of the windows in the front, and what we saw sent chills up my spine. We could see clear as day into the living room. There was a lamp on in the corner, and in the middle of the room, somewhat close to the window, was that trashy woman we saw who came and yelled at us before. She was standing still, doing nothing, just facing the window looking out at us. She had a borderline angry-looking expression. We yelled, asking for help, but when she wouldn't move, we were too creeped out to stay there and left. As we got back in the truck, about to drive to another house, my phone started vibrating. It was Mia calling me. Thank God. I picked up and asked her they were and what happened, but I could barely get a word in as Mia said there were two men with axes in their hands wearing masks over their heads walking towards them out of the woods, and that's why the girls screamed and they all ran away down the road. One of them was currently on the phone with 911 and they were waiting. It was out in the woods right on the side of the road. It wasn't long after that the call disconnected and I wasn't able to reach him again. So we waited on the side of the road, not far from the house. When we finally saw flashing lights coming down the road, we waved them down and asked them to help us find our friends first. We drove up the road until we saw our friends come out from the woods, waving their hands. We scooped them up and followed the police back to the house. Once there, we collected all of our belongings as Mia and the girls frantically recounted what they had just gone through. Oddly enough, the Airbnb was not broken into, and none of our stuff was taken. There was no sign of any men with axes. We also told the police about the cries for help in the lake, which I believe prompted a search team to come to the scene. By then, we were already long gone from that place. We never looked back. After much persistence and battling with Airbnb and the host, we got our money back for the stay, well, most of it. None of us could ever figure out this situation, like if it was all a trap. If the calls for help from the lake were linked with the men approaching the house with the axes, and if that woman was also affiliated somehow with this. Was it just to scare us out of there, or were they really going to attack us? I don't know, and I don't care. I just don't do remote places anymore after this, and I know the girls won't either. It was Memorial Day weekend of 2021. The world was recovering from COVID, and everyone was looking to celebrate. That included my friends and me. Our friend George has a really nice big boat. Well, his dad has a big nice boat, but George gets to use it. The lucky bastard was born into a lot of money. We do reap some benefits from being friends with him, though. Out in the bay was a big boat meetup planned for Memorial Day, so our core group, Grant, Hale, and I, all met up at George's house on the water, and we took the boat out from there to meet up with George's other boat friends. There were a bunch of boats tied together in a shallow part of the bay, and everyone was hopping from boat to boat and walking around in the water with drinks in hand. I was getting really drunk along with everyone else, and unfortunately, that included George. No one really realized until it was too late that he had way too much to drink and was not okay to drive the boat back home. I told him to sleep it off in the cabin, so he went down to sleep. It started to get dark after so many hours of drinking and mingling with other boat people, and one by one, the other boats left. We were the last boat left, just the four of us. I went to check on George, and he was still knocked out. We had to stall for hours with each other until he finally woke up. He did seem more sober now, so he started to slowly drive the boat back in the direction of his canal. On the way, we noticed the lights of another boat seemingly following us. George started freaking out, thinking it was the Bay Police. He didn't want to do anything suspicious like speeding up or slowing down, anything that might draw attention, so we kept our speed steady. We made it to the canal, and he lives about 5 minutes up the canal. The boat behind us was still following us up the canal. George was really starting to freak out, worried he'd get a DUI and lose his license, and of course, his dad killing him. The canal is a no-wake zone, so we had to slow it down even more. As we went down the canal, the boat behind us was catching up to us. At this point, we were fully expecting the boat to be a police boat. We started discussing a story to stick to, that we took the boat out and just hung out on the bay. We started hiding all the beer cans, ready to lie completely about having had any beer. We got to George's dock, and he looped the boat around to a line next to it. He did it pretty smoothly for someone who was intoxicated. The boat that was tailing us the entire time approached, and as it began to pass us, we realized it wasn't a police boat at all. It was just a random boat. George said out loud, "Who the hell is this? He knows everyone on his canal," and he said he'd never seen that boat. As it directly passed us, we saw 3 men standing on the back of the boat looking at us. It was honestly in a very aggressive way. George taunted them and said, "What?" None of them responded. Their boat passed us, and they continued to watch us. While we were all relieved it wasn't the police, George was now nervous as to why they followed us all the way down the canal when they don't even live on this canal. I said perhaps it's someone visiting a friend's house for Memorial Day, and he reluctantly agreed and said, "Could be." He tied up the boat to the dock, and we helped the best we could. He said he'd clean it tomorrow. We all went inside his house. His parents weren't home this weekend, he had the place to himself. So we suggested throwing a last-minute pool party, but it was already like 10 o'clock, and there wasn't really any chance of throwing anything big that last minute. So the 4 of us went back outside to just hang by the pool, continuing to drink, with all of us planning on crashing at George's place for the night. That boat passed by the house again within maybe 10 minutes, and that's when we really got suspicious. The men on the boat again stared at us, and this time George said nothing. The night became a daze. At some point after this, my memory gets really foggy, as I guess I blacked out. The next thing I remember is waking up with extreme cotton mouth in the middle of the night. At first, I thought the unbearable thirst I was feeling was what caused me to suddenly wake up, but I was very wrong. I looked around the room and saw Grant and Hale on the couch as well, sleeping. I went to the kitchen to drink some water from the faucet like a water fountain, that's how thirsty I was. But in the kitchen, I was met with someone else, dressed in a cliché all-black robbery outfit, including a black ski mask, and he was clear as day holding a gun. I didn't scream. He aimed the gun at me and told me not to make a sound. It was an unexplainable feeling, knowing that my existence could have ended at any given moment. And everything would turn black, washed over my body. He said to me in a quiet voice, "Where is the owner of the house?" I whispered, "I don't know." He asked me where the owner's bedroom is, and I shakily said, "Upstairs." He had me lead him upstairs with a gun to my back, threatening to shoot me if I made any sudden moves or calls for help. When I got to the top of the stairs, I realized there were 2 men behind me, not just one. Both of them were in the same all-black robbery attire. I really didn't want to, but I led them to George's room where he was passed out sleeping. The 2 men shut the bedroom door and had me wake George up without making a commotion. George came to reality, looking around the room and momentarily freaking out before one of the men got closer to him with the gun in his face, telling him to be quiet. The man with the gun pointed at George demanded to know where the safe was. George's family is loaded, and their house is huge along with their boat, and it's common for rich families to have a safe somewhere in the house. George led the 2 men and myself to his dad's room, to a certain closet. At this point, they forced him to call his dad to get the combination. George explained to his dad that we were being held at gunpoint and he needed to give the combination. George's dad complied. The two men took all the contents inside the safe and put them into a bag. This included savings bonds, cash, jewelry, and various important documents. After this, they ran out of the house. We didn't hear a car speed away or anything, so they must have had a getaway vehicle further away, not on the block. After posting on multiple outlets, including the Ring Neighbors feature and reporting it to local news outlets, no one could identify the two men. I think it's fairly safe to say those men on the boat followed us to find out where George lived, since it was a very nice boat and they must have seen potential dollar signs. I'd never been so scared in my life. I actually could have been killed if I made one wrong move. It was around noon on Memorial Day of 2017. My car was in the shop for a few days, so to the outside world, it would seem that no one was home. I was sitting in the living room watching television when I noticed a shadow being cast from the window behind me. I thought nothing of it as the window faces the street, and our front lawn is not very big. To me, it seemed like someone was just walking down the road, no big deal. Almost simultaneously, however, someone passed by the window to the carport heading to our side door. I went to check it out, and before I got to the door, he knocked. When I answered the door, I saw him in a white duct-taped motorized scooter, now under our carport. He told me he had been walking down the road pushing his scooter and he was wondering if he could rest for a moment. It was a hot day, and I could tell he had been walking. I decided to give him a break and let him sit under my carport for a minute. I even gave him a mellow yellow from the fridge, thinking if he had a cool drink, he would leave as soon as he was finished. I returned to my living room. Then there was another knock, but this time on the front door. I answered it, and this guy was asking if we were selling a scooter here. I told him no, and he apologized and then walked off. I closed the door and looked outside the window and saw that the guy in the scooter was still there. At this point, I was really suspicious, as most people would be. I decided to make something up to get the guy to leave by saying my friend was about to be here and that he needed to park there. When I opened the door, I asked him if he was feeling all right now, and he told me he was just resting. Before I could tell him my made-up excuse to get him to leave, the guy from the other door came from around the side of the house. He talked to the scooter guy and said, "Hey man, I've been looking everywhere for you. I thought you might have been stealing these people's scooter." They laughed for a moment and then both walked to the street with the scooter. I closed the door and decided to watch them from my front window. They both loaded the scooter in the back of a big red truck parked in the street that was not there when I talked to the front door guy. The driver was staring at the window I was looking out of, and after they got in, they took off. I called the police, and an officer came over almost immediately. I live a block from a police department. When I told the cop about what happened, he told me they had similar reports of a guy with a scooter casing houses, probably thinking that no one was home for the holiday. He told me that I probably scared them off since I was home. Still, though, I'm very lucky that they weren't violent. Every Memorial Day, I think about what happened. My husband Jack is in the military. We have generally lived on base at every station we have been to because the surrounding towns can be very crime-ridden and sketchy, and with my husband gone most of the time, the extra security is appreciated. I work from home due to us moving so often. One afternoon, I was taking a break, had made a bite to eat, and was snuggling up on the couch with my dog. That's when I heard the sliding glass door open. It was so nonchalant I thought it was Jack. I saw the cat run from the kitchen and a shadow standing near the door entering it. I thought maybe he had come back for something, so I called out for him and was like, "What are you doing home? Did you forget something?" No answer. This is where I just got an eerie feeling. After I asked what he was doing here, I saw the shadow move and heard the click of the sliding door lock. From there, he walked to the laundry room and shut the door. I still had received no response, so I'm sitting on the couch, scared out of my mind, and I call my husband, hoping to hear his phone in the laundry room. I don't hear a ring, but he does answer. I asked him why he came home, and he didn't answer me. All he says is, "That wasn't me. Grab the dog and get in your car." I freak out. After getting off the phone with Jack, I grab the dog and run to my car. From there, I called the military police. Waiting for them was probably the longest 20 minutes of my life. When they got there, they cleared the house and found no one. They asked me to make a statement, and even they were baffled that someone would try this on a base. We still live here. I'm just so scared that he'll come back. I first heard this story when I was in college. I'd come home for winter break, and I remember it was just me and my dad in the house. I was watching some kind of ghost hunter program on TV just for laughs. I don't really believe in that stuff, though when you watch the programs on TV, they're just so obviously fake. It's too hard for me to let go of my preconceptions and just watch and try to get into it. My dad was the same way, so I thought. He didn't seem interested in the paranormal or anything. He was kind of the guy who would scoff at anything supernatural. The program I was watching flipped to a commercial, and I casually got up and found my dad in the kitchen. Kind of out of the blue, I asked him, "Hey Dad, do you believe in ghosts?" His reply was so casual it shocked me. "Really?" I asked, a bit taken aback. "It just doesn't seem like you." He shrugged his shoulders and mulled over what I had just said. "Yeah," he replied, "eventually, but I know ghosts are real. I've met one." Upon hearing this statement, I had to know the story. You see, my dad is like me, he likes to tell stories. I could retell most of his stories from memory. Just because he would tell them so frequently to anyone who would listen, yet here was a story I had never heard of. An event that changed my dad's life. To this day, I don't even know if I believe it or not, but when someone who is so influential on your life, someone who seems so logical and so down to earth, tells you something like this, he calls into question what you believe and why. Though he never brings it up, when I talk to him about it, he swears it's completely true, no exaggeration and no doubt in his mind about what happened. So here it is, from his point of view. I was back in the house in Tacoma where you grew up until you were about 4. My parents still lived in the house, but I was going to college. I was back visiting them for a weekend. I was just over at Tacoma Community College, so it wasn't far away. I came back often to visit and get a home-cooked meal. I remember that I was sitting down for dinner with my parents, just the 3 of us. It was in the late spring, early summer season, so it hadn't really gotten dark yet. We were talking like normal when the phone rang in the kitchen. My mom got up and answered the phone, leaving my dad and me in the other room together alone. After a short while, she called my dad into the kitchen as well. "Leo, can you come here for a moment?" I remember that she seemed worried. Her voice was kind of shaking a bit. My dad wiped his face, got up, and joined my mom in the kitchen. They weren't in there for long, but they were talking quietly, and it felt strange. After a few moments, they finally came out of the kitchen. They had their coats on now. "Something's come up, and we have to go out for a bit," my mom said. "There's dessert in the fridge. Help yourself. Don't worry about the dishes. I'll wash them when we get back." My dad said nothing, but I could tell from his face that it was serious. My mom looked genuinely worried. They were out that door in a flash, and I was left to finish my dinner at the table. I cleared the table and washed my plate despite my mom's instructions, and I went into the main room to read. I sat down on the sofa, opened one of my school books, and began to relax. Hours went by, and my parents still hadn't come back. It was now around 11 o'clock, and I was just about to get ready for bed. I walked up the stairs, making my way to the bathroom when I heard a strange noise. I paused and listened for a while. It was the ceiling. The ceiling was making a slow, drawn-out whining noise. The wood was creaking gently. It wasn't an unusual sound, but there was an unusual rhythm to it that made me uncomfortable and curious. After listening for a while, I pulled down the steps to the attic and listened a bit more. I could hear the sound more clearly now, along with a metallic creaking noise. I gathered up my courage and decided to investigate. I climbed the steps. Now, I have to say, I wasn't scared. I didn't have an uneasy feeling, actually, to the contrary. I felt quite comfortable. Even though it was dark and eerie, the energy in the room wasn't foreign. It almost felt warm and inviting. As I looked around the attic, it quickly became obvious where the sound was coming from. Among the boxes and various other storage was an old rocking chair that belonged to my grandmother. It was one of many possessions that she had left with us at the house. She was in a nearby home for the elderly and couldn't fit much of her belongings in her room. The rocking chair was gently rocking back and forth, causing the floorboards to creak beneath it. Next to the chair, an old bird cage was displaying similar behavior. The cage door was gently swinging open and closed, making a quiet metallic creak. I figured there was a draft, and knowing that the sounds would keep me up all night if I didn't put an end to it, I set out in search of the source. I combed the corners of the room, but try as I might, I couldn't find the source of the draft, nor could I feel it myself. There were no windows, and there wasn't much ventilation. It wasn't even windy outside, it was a calm evening. Furthermore, the chair was heavy, as was the bird cage. Yet, there were other things nearby that weren't disturbed, stacks of paper and the like. After a while, I gave up and looked back to the chair. It was still gently rocking. I walked over to it and rested my hand on the armrest. The chair stopped rocking. Still, I couldn't feel any kind of draft. I lifted my hand, and the chair was calm and quiet. But as I turned away, I heard the creaking again. I turned back, and the chair was still rocking. It was really strange, but as I had said before, I wasn't really that creeped out yet. I shrugged it off and walked over to the birdcage. The door was still swinging open and closed. The cage had once housed a parrot belonging to my grandmother, but it had been empty for some time. I latched the cage shut, figuring I could at least stop this one sound. I made for the steps, but just as I was about halfway down, I heard the metallic creaking again. I looked behind me, and the cage door was back to swinging open, unlatched, right alongside the chair, which continued rocking as before. Something had caused it to unlatch. I was sure that I had latched it properly. In any other circumstance, I would have been scared out of my mind, but for whatever reason, I wasn't. I just didn't feel uneasy. A rocking chair and a birdcage aren't really the harbingers of doom anyway. I descended from the attic with a last glance at the strange behavior and went about my bedtime routine. The creaking continued for a while, and I couldn't sleep for it. I went back upstairs and made another attempt to find the source. I went back downstairs to where I couldn't hear the noise, and I continued reading. It was a little after midnight when I heard my parents pull into the driveway. They came in and found me reading, and they sat down with me. My mom was crying. They explained to me that they had spent the evening at the hospital where my grandmother had just passed away. That's the story as my dad tells it. He believes to this day that before she left this world, his grandmother came home to pay him one last visit. At the time of this story, I brushed it off, but it sends chills down my spine whenever I think about it. My younger brother and I have childhood friends that go to the beach with our moms for Memorial Day weekend every year. We've been doing this since before my younger brother was born. On our trip about 2 years ago, we had just arrived at the condo complex that we were staying at and had begun to unpack. We were on the first floor, so only 2 flights of stairs to get to our condo. There was some kind of construction happening a few floors above us, so there were trucks and workers. We had finally finished unpacking our stuff, and we were headed down to the beach when I remembered that I left my purse in the car. My mom gave me the keys, and they went down to the beach while I went to the car to grab my purse. But while I was getting it, an old pickup truck pulled into the parking lot, and an older man got out. He had paint on his shorts, so I figured he was a worker. But me, at the time being a teenage semi-petite girl, kept my eye on him. I got my purse, locked the car, and then started heading back to the stairs. I should also mention that the stairs were outside, open for everyone to see. The man started following me up the stairs, but he was several steps behind me. I figured he was headed up to the construction area, so I gave him the benefit of the doubt. Nevertheless, I started walking faster, and when I glanced behind me, the man was only 2 steps behind. This is when I really started to panic. I only had car keys and a purse on me, and I didn't know the layout of the condo yet. Where was the knife block? Was the door to the beach open? I finally reached the door to the condo, ran inside, and tried to close it behind me. The man was at the door and was trying to force it open as I was trying to force it closed. I finally just tried to run for it, hoping the sliding door to the balcony and beach was open. Luckily, my mom and my friend were still inside because they forgot to bring sunscreen down. I ran behind them, and the man just stood in the doorway. "Can we help you?" my mom asked. The man awkwardly smiled and mumbled something about looking for supplies and abruptly closed the door. After I calmed down, we went back to the parking lot, and his car was gone. I'm confident that the man thought I was going to be alone in that condo with him, and I don't like to think about what could have happened if my mom and friend weren't there. I work in the pro department of a home improvement company. I worked the closing shift with another cashier, who I'll call Aria. Aria's a really kind but quite timid cashier. She's also very pretty, so she has a lot of contractors hit on her. It's usually not that worrisome, though a few compliments, maybe a dinner invite, which she politely declined. I would probably ask her out as well if it wasn't for one detail: Aria does have a girlfriend. So being hit on by guys on a daily basis makes her rather uncomfortable. When we first met, I told her she ought to tell those guys about being gay, but she kept saying it wasn't any of their business, so she kept that part to herself. Aria has become my best friend, and having another cashier there with you keeps things from getting lonely. We even cover for each other's lunch breaks. One day, when I came back from lunch, Aria started telling me about this rather creepy guy who was flirting with her. She said she politely turned him down, saying she was with someone already, and while he didn't seem happy, he did leave. I shrugged it off as nothing more than the usual horny guy and laughed it off. But later that day, the man came back. Aria wasn't there, as she had left to help a customer find some lumber, so it was just me. He looked rather normal, probably handsome to most women, but he acted off. After looking around the area, I asked him if I could help him with anything. "I'm here to see Aria," he told me. I asked him how he knew her, and he said he had come in earlier and asked her out, to which she said yes, so he had come back in to pick her up. I told him she had left for the day, a usual lie everyone tells to cover for their friends. His smile went away as he started looking annoyed. He said he wanted to speak to Aria and ask her out again, which contradicted what he had just told me about accepting his previous invite. I told him he could not do that, which caused him to cross his arms and asked me why not. I'm not the best liar when it comes to making up excuses on the spot, however. I didn't want to tell him Aria was gay if she didn't want him to know it. So I just blurted out that Aria was my fiancée. His annoyed look went to confusion as he asked me how someone as pretty as she is could go out with someone like me. I'm not a Chris Evans or anything, but I don't think I'm that bad looking. I told him it didn't matter and that she and I were getting married in a couple of months, so he needed to back off. He gave me a death look but didn't say anything. After an awkward silence, he left. After Aria had gotten back, I told her what went down. She asked me to describe him, and after I told her what he looked like, she said that was the same guy who came in before. She was a bit creeped out by what went down but found the fiancé excuse rather funny. She even stated she'd rather be engaged to me than go out with him, which I'm guessing was a compliment. A couple of weeks went by, and we had all but forgotten about the man. At this point, one night after it had gotten dark, Aria and I were getting the trash together so we could close down the registers and go home. Just then, we heard a bang at the door, causing both of us to nearly jump out of our skins. It was the guy again. He had a wild look in his eyes as he kept his face pressed against the glass. "We're closed," I told him, but he insisted he needed to come in. Aria yelled again to tell him she's not interested and for him to go away and leave her alone. But he yelled that he's not here for her, he's here for me. He then says that if he can take out her husband, then she'd be all his. Based on that, he wanted to kill me. I told Aria to run to the manager's office and call the police, and I'd stay here and watch him. I won't lie though, I was pretty afraid to be in that tiny little area. If the guy was able to get in, he wasn't the biggest guy, but he could have had a weapon on him. Plus, the store doesn't allow us to have self-defense items on us, so I was on my own here. The guy then started ramming the sliding doors like he was crazy. The doors were rattling, I could have sworn they were going to come off their base. Just then, Aria came running back around the corner with a 2x4 in her hand, yelling that the cops were on their way. Finally, the man decided to leave. The closing manager met the officers when they came, and he took them to review the cameras. Thankfully, the man was caught and arrested, but Aria and I felt unsafe working there any longer. We're still friends and even attend the same college together, but we have separate jobs now while we pay our way through classes. I'm glad she was there to help me with the robe man, as I hate to imagine what he might have done to me, or worse, what he might have done to her. She says she's glad I was there for her as well, as having a guy around tends to make men like him less confident in what they might try. It was a wake-up call for me as to how dangerous it can be for some girls when an interested guy just doesn't want to take no for an answer. During the summer last year, I chose not to take any classes and got a job at a gas station right next to my college campus. I was sort of disillusioned with school and wanted to make some money while I had time off. The gas station was one of the first places I tried applying to, and it turned out to be the last when they hired me on the spot. I thought it was a little weird, but I didn't question it. Unfortunately, they said they only wanted me for the night shift, which was from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. I knew it would wreak havoc on my already messed up sleep schedule, but I decided to go for it and just see how it went. To my surprise, most of the time it wasn't that bad. The first few hours of the shift were pretty busy, and it would get crazy, but then it would always get really slow until about 5 o'clock in the morning. This gave me plenty of time to clean, stock the shelves, and chill out until the morning rush. Occasionally, somebody suspicious or problematic would wander in, but I never had anything get too out of hand. Well, that was of course until something did happen. It was a Thursday, which wasn't usually a busy night. I had a coworker until about midnight, then they went home, and I was left alone. Time went by pretty fast, and before I knew it, it was almost 2 a.m. That's around the time a man walked in, and I immediately had a bad feeling about him. He had a shaved head and a bunch of tattoos of weird symbols, so I was pretty sure he was a skinhead. I noticed he had parked his dirty old lifted pickup truck in the handicap spot too, but I didn't want to get on his case about it. It was 1:58 when he walked in, and he spent a few minutes wandering around the store. In the end, though, all he bought was a case of beer. However, by then it was 2:01. My county has a law that says alcohol can't be purchased between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. I told the man that, as politely and apologetically as I could, that he couldn't buy the beer. He immediately became agitated and went off on a rant about how it was a free country and that it was a stupid law. I tried my best to reason with him, and I said that I was just trying to do my job. But this only made him start to criticize me like I was some kind of spineless pawn for my boss. That's when I asked him to leave if he was going to be that way. Then he suddenly changed his tone again, acting all chummy and saying it wasn't a big deal and that I should bend the rules for just a few minutes since it was before 2 o'clock when he walked in. He kind of made a good point, so I eventually caved just so he would get out. I sold him the case of beer, and then, of course, he asked for a pack of cigarettes to go with it. I let him have it as there was no rule against tobacco sales. He smiled at me and then left the store. I breathed a sigh of relief, but that relief was short-lived. I thought he would get in his truck and leave, but instead, he opened the tailgate and sat down on the truck bed. He cracked open a can of beer and started drinking it. Now I had a feeling that this was far from over, and that was exactly the case. A few minutes later, another truck pulled up right next to his, and a couple of guys got out, both of them with shaved heads and tattoos. They stood around the back of the first guy's truck, just smoking and drinking. I knew I had to go out there and tell them that they couldn't loiter in front of the store and that it was illegal to drink out in the open like that, especially that close to a car. But I was a little scared already. They kept looking in the window at me, smirking as if they knew what I was thinking and were challenging me to try. Before I could find the courage, another car, this time an SUV, pulled in next to the two of them, and two more guys got out and joined the others. They were all part of the same skinhead group, without a doubt. My guess is they were coming from a bar that had just closed and didn't want to end the night yet. That was the most reasonable explanation, but my paranoid thoughts made me think they were about to get together and burn down the store because the owner's wife was Mexican. Then the first guy came back into the store. He was drunker than before and all smiles. But then he came back to the register with another case of beer. I was about to tell him he definitely couldn't buy it at that time, but before I could even open my mouth, he looked at me all smug and said he really wouldn't want to disappoint him and all of his friends. I took that as a pretty solid threat, so I let him do what he wanted. My hands were shaking, and I was dreading having to count change in front of him. But then he told me to keep the change, like he was giving me some kind of big tip. He walked back outside, and all the skinheads cheered at the fresh case of beer. Apparently, they had worked together and finished all 24 cans of the previous one. I then realized they had been tossing the empty cans all over the ground and kicking them around. It felt like I was completely stuck with these pricks, and I knew I would either get in trouble over it or get literally ganged up on and have any manner of horrible things done to me just for saying no to them. What normal person would see a bunch of drunk skinheads smoking cheap cigarettes on top of their pickup trucks in front of a store in the middle of the night and still want to walk past them to get in? Pretty much nobody, not a single person, except more of the skinheads. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I walked up and locked the door so they couldn't get back in. Then I walked back to the office and called the police. Several minutes later, a cruiser showed up and told them to screw off. There was some shouting outside that I couldn't quite make out, but I was worried for a few minutes that things would escalate. Thankfully, they left without causing too much of a scene, but I have no idea how close it got. The cop waited for them to leave before doing so himself. Right before he got on his way, I came out and asked him to stay a while I cleaned up their mess. The next day, I unfortunately had to quit that job. There was nothing more terrifying to me than the thought of being stuck behind that register if those guys ever decided to come back. Still, I kind of get worried that one of them will see me around town and recognize me. I don't know what those people are all capable of. All I know is my town is full of dudes like that, and they're always causing problems. Years ago, I worked as a barista at a locally owned coffee shop that doubles as a popular venue for local artists and musicians to host all sorts of small-time gigs. Even today, it gets most of its business in the evenings during the open mics and stays open until 1 a.m. However, when I worked there pre-2020, they were open 24/7 from Thursday to Sunday. For the most part, everyone that worked there hated the graveyard shift. It was easy hours, but the tips were abysmal as barely anyone came in. As far as I was concerned, however, I didn't mind the lower pay. What I hated was being alone and running the only place that was still open for miles. The shop was in a good part of town, if not a little close to a bad part, but the fact of the matter is that there's really no such thing as a good side of town during these overnight hours, if we're being completely honest. I was advised to never keep more than $50 in the drawer during the graveyard shift for a reason. I was always afraid that somebody would drag me into the back of the store, so every time I was scheduled for the overnight shift, I asked one of my male friends to come hang out with me. The one guy who would help me more than anyone else was named Bob. It usually turned out to be a good time. I made some money, I slipped him some beers under the table, and of course, I felt much more comfortable not being a woman on her own. Bob would work on his laptop while I was busy, and we would talk when things were slow. We had been friends for a while, but we became close after spending a lot of time together. It was always platonic, though. Bob was also friends with many of my coworkers, and lots of us joked that Bob knew so much about the coffee shop that he might as well work there himself. But he always laughed it off and said his career in photography was more important, which we always gave him a hard time for. I didn't really think there would ever be any bad blood between us, and if there was, I was sure it would be because we slipped up and had an awkward one-night stand. But then came a slow Saturday night in the summer of 2019. I was working the last overnight shift of the weekend. I had worked the last 2 nights in a row without Bob because he had bailed on me to go to a wedding for one of his family members. I managed to get another friend of mine to fill in for him for Thursday and Friday, but on Saturday night, they were too tired and never showed up. I was anxious about being alone in the shop, but I knew I could manage. Thankfully, it was surprisingly slow that night for some reason, and by 3 a.m., I had only made $10 in tips. But I was glad I didn't have to deal with any crazy people. Unfortunately, that's when things took a dark turn. The shop was completely empty except for me. I was putting a batch of coffee into the roaster when, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure walk past the front window. I glanced over, but there was nobody there. I waited for someone to come around to the back door, which customers could also use, but a full minute had passed now, and nobody came. I stuck around by the register for a few more minutes, but after nobody showed up for a while, I decided it was time to mop the floors. I went into the back to fill up the mop bucket, and of course, as soon as I turned the faucet on, I heard somebody come in through the front door. I shouted that I would be with him in just a minute, then finished filling up the bucket and rolled it out behind the counter. When I got there, whoever came in had disappeared. I shrugged it off, just figuring they had gone straight to the bathroom, and then I started mopping behind the counter. The stranger's feeling hovered over me. I couldn't place what it was, but I knew something was wrong. The first thing I looked at was the drawer, but it hadn't been broken into. Even then, that would have been loud enough for me to hear over the running water. I leaned over the bar and checked the bathroom doors. The men's room door was closed, and the light was on, so I knew somebody was in there. My stomach churned slightly as I knew it was a man in there, but so far I had no real reason to think anything was wrong, so I just kept on mopping. When I finally got finished behind the counter, the bathroom door opened, and to my surprise, Bob walked out. I immediately felt a sense of relief, but I had to ask him what he was doing there. He explained that he had just gotten home from the wedding and thought he'd stop by and say hi. I was grateful that he decided to show up, so I told him he could have whatever he wanted on the house. I got behind the espresso machine and got to work pulling a shot. I packed the grounds into the portafilter and locked it into the machine, then looked over to say something to Bob. But whatever I was thinking of saying was immediately forgotten. His facial expression had gone from friendly to devilish in just a moment of time, and suddenly a wave of chills went through my body. "What are you doing?" I asked, fighting back trembling. Bob grinned like a psychopath and pulled a knife out from behind his back. "I'm finally going to bang the barista," he said as he started to laugh. "Don't be crazy," I shouted. "We're friends." "What about the cameras?" Bob began walking forward, forcing me to backpedal. "We are friends," he said, "and nobody will believe you because the cameras aren't even on." "They never are." "How do you not know that?" I knew at this point I was being pushed into the back of the shop, and my throat started to close up. It was also in that moment, when I looked for an exit, that I realized he had locked both the doors and turned the open sign off, keeping anybody from coming in. "Your boss already thinks we do this every night," Bob pressed on, inching closer and closer. "Stop it." I shouted in desperation, looking for something to defend myself and trying not to slip on the wet floor. "Shut up," you screamed. "You should have been giving this to me for months already. Do you not know how much time I wasted on you?" I was pleading and about to be cornered. The last hope I had was something on the sandwich counter. In the last moment before he pushed me out of sight into the back of the shop, I grabbed for the panini press and ripped it off the table, slamming the corner of the metal against the side of his head. He tried to block me and sliced open my arm, but I connected the hit. Combined with the water on the floor, the blow knocked him off of his feet. I wasted no time climbing over the counter and rushing out of the back door. I slipped into my car while I locked myself in and called the police. It wasn't until I thought about driving off that I realized Bob had parked his car in front of mine to deliberately keep me from getting away. Moments later, while I was on the phone with the operator, he came outside and attempted to break his way into my car. After he failed to do so for several minutes, he gave up and drove off, not long before the police arrived. I was treated for my wound and gave my statement about what happened. I didn't leave out a single detail. I was too much in a state of shock to even be in disbelief. As it turns out, he was right about the cameras inside the shop just being for show. However, nobody thought I was lying about what he did. Unfortunately, though, due to civil liabilities on the part of my employer and, more importantly, the fact that Bob completely up and disappeared after posting bail, I decided to drop the charges. I came to the conclusion not long after that he had already ruined his life sufficiently, and I simply didn't care enough to do anything else about it. Nobody has seen or heard from Bob in years, and the coffee shop has since stopped staying open overnight. I've been a night owl my whole life, so I work night shifts exclusively. I really don't work well with other people, whether they're my coworkers or not, so I picked a job I could do completely on my own. I became a nighttime janitor for my local school district after I graduated from high school. Schools have always had nightly cleaning as part of health codes in most areas, but obviously, in recent years, it's become much more important. My first job was in a fairly large K-12 school. There were a couple of daytime custodians as well, but at night it was just me and one other person splitting the school down the middle. My coworker and I barely ever interacted, which I appreciated a lot. Every single night, all the floors get mopped, revacuumed, every desk, table, and door handle is disinfected, and every toilet, urinal, and sink also gets cleaned. It takes a full 8-hour shift to accomplish, and for that entire time, I don't talk to a single person. It's great, honestly. Most of my coworkers are women, and they don't want me talking to them either. When I tell people about my job, a lot of them think the hardest part is cleaning up after the messes left by the students. For the most part, I guess they are right, but I always tell them I would rather plunge and clean 10 clogged and traumatized toilets every single night than ever have to work directly with another human being all day long, especially a horde of minors. These days, there's one example I give of why I say that. It was the night after Halloween. I came in for my usual shift and got started without even saying hello to my coworker. We started on opposite ends and met in the middle, so we would only see each other when we were finishing up. The first hour was mostly normal except for one obvious thing out of the ordinary. I always keep my music at a low volume on my headphones, but from outside them, I kept hearing things. Usually, all the other faculty are gone by 8 p.m., but sometimes there's somebody who stays late. I couldn't decide what I was hearing through my music, but I wasn't in the mood to turn it off, so I just ignored it. A little while later, I took a break from mopping to change the water in the bucket. I was gone for about 5 minutes, but on my way back to where I stopped, I walked past one of the hallways I had just mopped and noticed the wet floor sign had fallen over. For legal reasons, I had to step over the wet floor and stand it back up, then mop back over my tracks. Annoyed, I walked over to it but froze for a moment when something else caught my eye. There was another set of tracks in the water, leading to and from the sign. They were little footprints, something a kid would make. After I stood the sign back up, I followed the tracks, knowing I would have to mop over those two, basically redoing the whole hallway. The tracks ran all the way to the end, where there was a flight of stairs up to the second floor. From there, they dried up pretty quickly. I stormed up the stairs and got to the second floor, but nobody was there. I took my phone out of my pocket and paused my music so I would be able to hear if anyone was running around. Right as I looked down, I saw a flash of movement at the end of the hallway. I also heard a bunch of footsteps echoing across the empty school, so I started making my way to the end of the hall. By the time I got there, I still couldn't see anyone, but then I heard a little kid laughing. It felt like I was in a horror movie, but at that point, I was more annoyed than scared. I stood there looking around for a few seconds until I heard a crash from the first floor. I rushed downstairs and nearly flipped my lid when I saw the mop bucket I had just refilled was knocked over. The water was spilling everywhere in a huge pool. I absolutely swore my head off as I went back to the nearest janitor's closet for a dry mop and a bunch of towels. It took me half an hour to clean up that mess and then another 15 minutes to redo the hallway that got messed up, which meant my break was down to 15 minutes. However, I was so pissed off that I walked to the other side of the school and interrupted my coworker to ask if she had been messing with me. She looked completely dumbfounded and innocent. She asked if I was all right or needed any help, but to that, I just walked away. I set up again and got back to work. Another hour passed, and I managed to make up some lost progress. I was angrily powering through it, debating in my head the whole time about what I should do. I thought about reporting it to the school or maybe just calling the police myself, but in the end, I figured I would seem crazy to everyone, just like I did to my coworker, so nothing happened. Again, until 11 o'clock, out of nowhere, the lights shut off in the whole school. It was pitch black for about 3 seconds until the emergency lights turned on, giving everything a reddish hue. It came as a shock to me, and to be honest, I was worried. I tried to tell myself it was a malfunction or maybe some kids messing around, but my mind was going to all sorts of possibilities. I had keys to the electrical room where the light switches were, and I was the closest to it, so I stopped what I was doing and marched over. I was pissed off about losing more time and missing out on my entire break. But halfway there, something pushed those concerns out of my head. I heard the most blood-curdling scream of my life, the panic shriek of my coworker echoing endlessly. I stopped in my tracks, feeling like I had just been hit by an electric shock. Seconds later, I heard the sound of a door opening really loudly, like someone was ramming through it from the inside. I hoped it was my coworker escaping and not somebody else making their way into the school. I forced myself to keep going and finally made it to the electrical room. I was right outside the door trying to find the right key when I noticed that it was already cracked open. I pushed it open slowly, afraid of what I might see, and a shape appeared in front of me, standing unnaturally in the darkness. My blood ran cold. It could have been anyone. I gave up on trying to turn on the lights and instead reached over for my phone in my pocket. However, as soon as I moved, the figure bolted forward and slammed the door in my face. I cursed and jumped back, stumbling until my back hit the wall behind me. Once I regained my balance, I started running. I wanted to leave, but for once in my life, I thought about the well-being of somebody else and ran to the other side of the school to find my coworker. After checking a few of her hallways, I finally found her mop bucket sitting alone in the middle of the floor next to a bathroom. Without hesitation, I rushed over to it, hoping not to see any evidence that she had been hurt. Nothing seemed unusual except for the fact that she was nowhere to be found. I looked all around in the dim lighting, but as far as I could tell, I was alone. But not completely alone. The sound of a laughing child echoed in the distance again, striking fear into my chest. I clutched the handle of the mop, for lack of anything else to defend myself with, and lifted it out of the bucket, holding the end of the handle out like a spear. I faced the direction of the laughter, looking down the hallway so intently I got tunnel vision. In a moment of sheer terror, someone whispered, "Hello," into my ear. I turned around and, without thinking, jabbed the handle of the mop into their chest with all my might. I heard a grunt as the person who snuck up on me hit the ground and vomited only a second later. I shouted at them to tell me who they were, but then they started to cry. I could tell they were trying to hold it back, but they couldn't. Gradually, my eyes made out what I was looking at. It was a student kneeling on the floor. Suddenly, all my fear of danger was replaced with the fear of losing my job for hitting a student. However, as things shook out over the next few days, it turned out all right. Two twins in the 9th grade and their little brother got the idea to keep the spirit of Halloween going and prank the overnighters in the school by hiding in the lockers. There was one set of lockers in the whole building that wasn't in use and had no locks or ties on them, and those kids were skinny enough to fit in there and hide. After doing their after-school activities, they managed to avoid being expelled, probably from crying a lot. The school district understood my actions and let me keep my job, but I was transferred to a different school. All in all, this is why I don't like people, especially kids. Up until about a year ago, I worked at a grocery chain. I was, and still am, a working college student. My availability was only 6 p.m. to closing, which in this case was midnight. It wasn't my favorite job. I dealt with a lot of annoying customers and coworkers, one of whom once broke into my locker and put a used tampon in the pocket of my apron, but that's a whole different story. My job was walking distance from where I lived, which made it really convenient since I didn't have a car. One Friday night, I was closing as usual with my supervisor, and we were running later than we usually did. My supervisor and I finally got the remaining customers out of the store, clocked out, and left. I left before my supervisor and began walking home. After a long, frustrating day of annoying customers, it felt great to just walk through the fresh winter air. I spent a few minutes shuffling through my phone's playlist to find a song to walk home to. I had made my way down the main road, careful not to slip on any of the ice. One thing that's really important to know about me is that I'm a very anxious person, and while it's definitely a problem most of the time, it does help make me constantly aware of my surroundings. That's when I saw an approaching car slowing down on the deserted main road, and I automatically went on high alert. It was a black car that came to a slow stop against the sidewalk I was on, about 10 feet behind me. I immediately clutched my phone in my hand and brought it out of my pocket. If there wasn't any ice covering the sidewalk and my feet didn't hurt, I probably would have run. Instead, I opted to try and pretend that I wasn't afraid, which I don't think worked because I picked up my pace after the car stopped. It was then that I heard a man's voice call out to me. "Hey, it's cold out here. You want a ride?" the man said. I kept walking away from him up the street, pretending I didn't hear him and just hoping he would go away. It didn't work. A few moments later, I heard the car tires crushing the ice on the road and then turned around to see what he was doing. He was now driving with the car in reverse. When he caught up to me, he had rolled down the passenger seat window some more. He was a black man, maybe in his mid to late 30s. He looked at me and I stopped, prompting him to stop his car as well. "Hey, let me give you a ride," he said through the car window. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to be polite because even though I was scared, I tried to be rational. All he did was offer a girl a ride home who was walking in the cold at night. Also, with the possibility of him being a kidnapper or a rapist, it was really best not to piss him off on the empty street. "No thank you," I said politely but firmly that I hesitated for a second. I was trying to figure out what to say that would get him to leave me alone away which street I lived on. "I'm okay," I insisted. "Thanks, though." As I finished thanking him, I started walking again, now putting both headphones in with the song paused. It was more of a way to signal that I was done talking to him. He didn't say anything, but I knew that he was watching me walk away. I felt relieved when I got a few more feet away from his car and heard the sound of his tires driving away. Unfortunately, the situation was only getting worse. As I started walking past the entrance of a car dealership, I saw the same car making a U-turn in the middle of the street out of the corner of my eye. When I turned slightly, he pulled up to the sidewalk yet again, this time a few feet in front of me. The man then opened the driver's seat door and got out of the car. It was at that point I was actually afraid I wouldn't make it home that night. He looked at me with this weird expression on his face. He had this really focused look while trying to look casual. It's really hard to describe. He started walking up to me. This kind of situation had never happened to me before, but I always thought of dangerous hypothetical situations in my head. I guess thinking about those situations prepared me to an extent because before I even realized it, my phone was already against my ear like I was on the phone with someone, even though I wasn't. When he came closer to me, he saw my phone in my hand and must have realized someone could know where I am right now, or I could be calling 911. That's the only explanation I can think of because when he looked at my phone, his demeanor totally changed. He stopped in his tracks with a worried look on his face and then asked me, "Oh, are you on the phone with someone right now?" I replied, looking at him with my phone still against my face and my other hand casually in my pocket. Without saying anything else, the man immediately turned around, got back in his car, and then started to drive up the street. I walked slowly at first, letting some distance grow between us, but as soon as I felt safer, I walked up the street as fast as I could without slipping. I frantically tried to call my dad, who I thought was home at the time. He didn't pick up. I then tried to call my sister and my fiancé. I didn't feel like I was in danger anymore, but my adrenaline was through the roof and I wanted to hear from someone who would make me feel better. I gave up calling after I couldn't get in touch with anyone and just kept walking. I was finally getting ready to turn onto another street when I passed an empty parking lot and saw the same man leaning against his car looking over at me. "Hey," was all he said in a flat tone when I walked by. At this point, I was completely freaked out. I didn't have my phone out anymore, so I couldn't pretend I was talking to someone again, and I was also significantly closer to my house. If he decided to get into his car and follow me, there wasn't any detour I could take to try and lose him. I was now on the verge of tears, and that's when I decided to call 911. I called 911 and told them the situation. The officer on the other line stayed on the phone with me until I got into my house. After that, an officer came to my house and asked me a bunch of questions about the man. He also asked me about his car and where I last saw him. All of the details were either too vague or I didn't remember. He said that he would at least patrol the area for him. I'm not really sure if he actually did or not, but it made me feel better at the time. From that point, I needed a ride to and from work every shift until I got my schedule changed to day shifts. Just a few weeks later, the college semester ended and I was planning on skipping a semester anyway. That experience only reinforced my decision. The more I think about that situation, the more I realize how lucky I was. I was in the perfect position to be taken, but I actually used some quick thinking that really de-escalated the situation. I moved in with my fiancée, and now I have a pocket knife and pepper spray for whenever I walk home at night from my new job. It's something to remember. If you haven't called 911, if you don't have anything to defend yourself against someone, either let someone know where you are or pretend that they know where you are. It can potentially save your life. The New York City subway system is a scary place. I've been an MTA worker for 7 years, and nothing really surprises me anymore. When friends and family ask if I have any stories, though, there is one that stands out among the rest, one that I can't explain. This happened to me about 2 years into the job, but I remember it like it was yesterday. I was pretty acclimated to everything at that point, and things had become routine. I was stationed in Brooklyn at the time, and I was doing some routine maintenance in High Street Station. There wasn't a soul on the platform. It was actually kind of eerie. You're used to these subway stations overflowing with people, so seeing them empty and almost deserted looking was a strange adjustment to make. I hadn't seen a person on the platform in hours, and it was dead silent except for the buzz of the lights and the occasional passing train. Out of nowhere, I heard a clang from somewhere down the track. It startled me so badly that I dropped my mop in shock. The sound wasn't something I was used to hearing. The best way I could describe it to you is that sound that a rock would make if it had been dropped on a metal rail. I stopped what I was doing and looked into the tunnel, listening for other noises. After a while, I concluded that whatever I heard had either been caused by an animal or a falling piece of cement. After all, these stations were pretty old. I went back to work, not thinking too much about the sound. About 10 minutes later, the same sound shook me from my concentration. Only this time, it was probably about twice as loud. This time, I actually became a little concerned, dare I say, scared. Was it really possible that 2 chunks of the ceiling had fallen in the span of 10 minutes? I put down my supplies and walked over to the tunnel entrance, trying to be quiet. I peered into the darkness and couldn't really see anything. I debated whether or not it was a good idea to call out into the tunnel and ultimately decided against it. I still figured it was nothing, but after the initial fear had worn off, I was more confused than anything. I kept trying to think of things that could make a sound like that, not once, but twice. It was especially bizarre since the second sound was louder. I tried to keep my mind off the sounds and went back to work, finding a good rhythm again. I was almost done with my work on this platform and was pleased that I'd get to leave this weird station soon. As I was wrapping things up, I heard something that gave me the chills. A child's voice called out for help from inside the tunnel, and he sounded like he was in distress. I instantly stopped what I was doing and made my way over to the edge of the platform. I hesitated for a few seconds before deciding that a child in anguish wasn't something my moral conscience would allow me to ignore. I walked down the steps leading onto the tracks and waited for my eyes to adjust to the darkness. I shouted into the tunnel, asking the kid if he was okay. No response. That's weird, I thought, starting to feel nervous about this encounter. Just then, the kid's voice rang out again, repeating his call for help. I yelled back, asking him if he could hear me. He responded, yes, and I asked where specifically he was. There was a brief moment of silence before he just said, in front of you. Just keep walking. I really didn't want to, but couldn't just leave some helpless kid all alone on those tracks. It was dangerous. I began walking forward when something dawned on me. I yelled into the darkness one more time, this time asking the kid what was wrong. An uncomfortable pause again before the kid responded, "Just keep walking." I didn't like that. This whole thing was off. My eyes finally adjusted to the darkness, and I was able to slightly make out what was in front of me. There actually was what looked like the shadow of a kid just up the tracks, but there was something else that almost made me scream in fear, another shadow, this one much taller, obviously an adult. My blood ran cold, and I stopped in place. This wasn't happening to me. As slowly as I could, I turned around and made my way back to the platform. Luckily, I wasn't chased on the way back. The kid shouted, "Wait, where are you going?" once I reached the platform, but I wasn't sticking around another second. I made my way up the stairs and called the police as soon as I got cell service. I told them everything, and police were swarming the platform in a matter of minutes. I waited to see what they turned up. After about 30 minutes of searching, they did find something chilling. There was a single kid's shoe just lying in the tunnel, which the police hypothesized could have signified a struggle. After hours more of searching and scouring every available database for missing children, we were told we'd receive a call if anything ever came up. It was concluded that whoever had been down there, though, had hidden somewhere in the tunnels. I have no idea what to think of this experience. This is the best theory I can come up with. Some psycho kidnapped a child and forced him to yell for help in an attempt to lure some unsuspecting Good Samaritan into a trap. Or hell, maybe it's their own kid who they're raising to also be a psycho. I can't think of any other reasonable explanation besides this one. But if I'm right, I can only imagine what that kid must be going through. My dad has been an MTA Transit subway station manager for 35 years. With this job, there has to be a manager on duty at all times, so he's practically done every single possible shift throughout his career. That means he's done his fair share of night shifts. Most trains were completely empty throughout the night. He said it was the only nice part about doing the night shift. He has a series of funny and weird night shift stories to tell, but there's one downright horrifying one. My dad had just boarded the train to move to his office at another station. He was alone when he got on, which was at about 2 o'clock in the morning. At the next station, someone boarded. My dad describes him as a white, tall, and skinny man wearing a heavy jacket and beanie. He shot my dad a quick glance before sitting in the farthest corner away from him. My dad said that he felt uncomfortable as the guy kept looking up at him every so often. When my dad's stop came, he got off, as well as the other man. He walked to his office door, unlocked it, and looked behind him. The man in the jacket was pacing around only about 50 feet away. My dad stepped into his office, shut the door, locked it, and sat at his desk. 5 minutes later, someone started to try and turn the doorknob. After the person on the other side of the door realized it was locked, they started to knock softly. My dad called out, "Who is it?" and they responded, "I want to talk." He told whoever it was to go away. He says he knew trouble when he saw it. He had a good feeling it was the guy from the train, as this station at a time like this was apparently always completely empty. My dad told the guy to go away. He continued to knock for a good 5 minutes. My dad finally pulled up the security camera screens and brought up the camera pointed at his office door. Sure enough, it was the guy from the train, wearing the jacket and beanie. Coincidentally, as soon as my dad brought up the camera, the man walked away. So, my dad did whatever his work consisted of for about half an hour in that office before leaving to catch the next train. He checked the camera to make sure that the weird guy wasn't out there. He locked up and walked down the stairs to the train platform, where he got on the train right away. Looking out the window, he saw the guy from before walking down the stairs to the platform and then stepping on the train into the same car as my dad. He sat down on the opposite side, a few seats to the right. My dad tried to look away and pretend not to notice him, but he knew the guy was staring at him. He at one point gave in and stared back, giving a slight nod and smile in some sort of truce attempt before looking away again. The man stared at my dad the whole ride to the next station, but my dad never looked back at him once after the first time. Now, you may be asking, why didn't he try to forcibly get the guy to back off? Well, despite my dad's intimidating size, he's always been a complete teddy bear, no bark and no bite. Plus, he says he feared that the guy was armed and that one small motion could lead to death. When the train stopped at the station, my dad practically ran all the way back up to the streets, constantly glancing over his shoulder. And yes, the man from the train was following him. My dad had to find the first public building still open to try and escape. He found a Wendy's that was open and stepped inside. He sat and watched as the guy following him walked up to the window, stopped, and stared my dad down through the glass for about 10 seconds before turning around and walking across the street and then down the sidewalk. My dad said he ate, waited a little longer, then left the Wendy's to get to his third and final station for the night. The scariest part, when my dad was in his third office, as he was checking the security cameras out of paranoia of the situation, he caught the guy from the train pacing around the outside only about 30 feet from his office. He then stopped, looked up at the camera, and, according to my dad, literally froze and stared for no less than a minute. When he finally lowered his head, he walked away out of the station to never be seen by my dad again. My dad doesn't know if he was followed after leaving the Wendy's, but that would only make sense. The guy was clearly disturbed, possibly homeless, or dangerous. Who knows what he actually wanted with my dad? Me and my 3 friends were in New York around Christmas time. We didn't finally decide to leave until about maybe 2 o'clock in the morning. We got on the first train that we could catch, and as expected, it was empty. We were pretty sobered up by then. Then there was a sudden commotion in the next car over. We had peeped through the glass in between the cars and there were 2 hooded men, or maybe teenagers, standing obnoxiously close to a woman sitting in one of the seats who was screaming for help. I suggested that we go over and kick their asses, but as me and a buddy got a closer look, we saw they were armed with handguns. I pushed all my friends to get to the next car over, away from the armed men. I took a look back and saw one of the men pointing at us before starting to follow. We ran through at least 3 different cars with the men following us before the train finally stopped at the next station. We all booked it through the old station to the nearest place we could hide. I got separated from my friends, so I went to hide behind a garbage can. I could hear my chaser's shoes hitting the tiled floors, so I knew I had no time to find a better hiding spot. I peeked through the opening at the top of the bin. I could get a better look at them now. One was black, the other was Indian, and they were both really young looking. I was sure they were only trying to rob us until I heard one of them say, "If you find them, kill them." I hope you understand why I almost gave away my position in reaction to hearing this, with a gasp and almost pulling the garbage bin down with me as I returned to cover it. I consider it a miracle neither of them caught me. They left the area. I took notice that they didn't have their guns drawn at that moment. I ran in the opposite direction of the 2 and quickly caught my friends who were waving me over from behind a large pole. I took cover with them behind another pole not far from that one, and we waited for as long as we thought necessary. The big shock to the story, though, was when we caught a glimpse of the woman from the train, who we thought was being threatened by the two men, walking over in the direction of the men and then calling something along the lines of, "Where are they? Don't tell me you didn't get them." The two men reappeared from beyond a corner, walking over to the woman. The rest of what they said was too low to pick up on. They walked back down the stairs to the platforms and, as we could guess, waited for another train to run their trap again. At the very least, we called the police and reported what was going on, but I have no idea if they were ever caught. My name is Valor. I'm 24 years old, and this was the most horrifying experience of my life. I live and work in New York City, but I don't have a car, so my main mode of transportation is the subway. It was a Saturday night. I was on my way home from a party in the middle of the night. I did this about every other weekend, so I was completely fine with taking the subway alone at night. Walking down the steps, entering the underground without a soul in sight, it was always a bit chilling. This specific station was very tightly spaced. As I was walking, I could almost feel as if I were being watched or followed, along with the occasional echoing bang-type sound emitting from an unknown location. I was early for the train, so I sat on a bench and waited. This is something straight out of a horror movie. I heard this exact phrase, "Over here, buddy." There was somebody standing on the tracks inside the tunnel, poking his head out and looking at me. It was a filthy-looking man, I'd say in his early 40s. He gave me a smile, a horrible yellow smile with at least 3 teeth missing, and I could tell that even from where I was sitting. I did the best I could to pay no attention to him, but he wouldn't go away. There was laughing coming from inside the tunnel, and then another disgusting-looking man stuck his face out as well. This man gave me a nasty smile as well before telling me to come hang out with them in the tunnel. The way they stared at me, though, their eyes wouldn't even move, it's as if their sight was locked onto me. I resumed doing the best I could to ignore them and just wait for the train. I noticed in my peripheral vision that one of the men moved away into the tunnel, returning moments later with another face. I had to look again. There was a third face, but this one was hunched over and lifeless. It looked like one of the men was holding the guy's face up. The sound of the train approaching felt like 1,000 pounds off my shoulders. I got up, ready to board the train, but when I got closer to the edge of the platform, I nearly threw up at the sight. The two men were going back into the tunnel, and the second man in the back was holding something in his hand, a head, just a head, like a decapitated head. They disappeared from sight onto the side of the tunnel as the train stopped. I got into the first car, planning on warning the conductor, but no later than after we left the station. I didn't want to be there a second longer. As the train began to move, I saw legs moving down the stairs to the platform, but that was it. I didn't get to see who it was. But what I did get to see as the train moved into the tunnels was a glimpse of a group of men hunched up against the railing, inches away from the train window, and they were all looking right at me. I knocked on the conductor's door like a madman, screaming it was an emergency. He opened up, and I explained what I just saw. He radioed to somebody in charge of the station as well as another higher-up of the company, who I'm sure took care of it or contacted the proper authorities or security, whatever. It seemed to take ages for my stop to come, but when it did, I practically had to hop in my walk from relief. I have since been to one party at the same friend's house, but I skipped that station. I decided it was worth it to take the extra long walk to the next station. I don't know if weird shit happens often in the subway at night. In my experience prior to this incident, it never did. But after this experience, I think I should say you should be extremely cautious when in an isolated place like a subway station late at night. This is narrated from the perspective of a female. This happened a few years ago in Rome, Italy. I was walking alone along the street that leads to the train station. It was around 2 p.m. on a working day, so almost practically no one was around. There were not many shops either on that street, and the few that existed were closed. A man was walking in my same direction just a few meters ahead of me. Casually, he turned back and noticed me. It was one of those instinctive reactions that you cannot conceal. His face said it all. He was roughly 6 foot tall and well built, not exactly the body structure you would like to see such a face on. His eyes openly said, "I've been to jail and I'm highly likely to go back again." He went along his way ahead of me and then turned again a couple more times, slowing down his pace. In a few moments, the situation was reversed. I was walking in front of him now. I didn't turn around. It was useless. I knew he was following me. I didn't hurry up. I just pretended I didn't notice him. I was listening to the radio on my smartphone with earbuds in and just simply kept on doing it. But you can imagine just how much I was panicking on the inside, all alone on the street with a 6-foot-tall criminal walking after me. I kept walking, struggling to the very last bit of my soul, acting as if nothing was happening, while desperately searching for an escape out of the situation. Then, after a few more minutes like this, I saw 2 men talking vivaciously outside of their shop. I seized the occasion and stopped right after them, pretending to scroll up and down on my phone. With the tail of my eye, though, I kept glancing beyond the 2 men, and I was right because after a few moments I saw him stretching his neck trying to spot me. He saw I had stopped and he was leaning against the wall near the 2 other men. He then turned back and went away. I'm pretty sure that I must have had a guardian angel that day who sent those 2 men and placed them at the right time and right place. Nothing else happened, but only because I was extremely lucky. To all the ladies out there, never take for granted that you're safe just because you're in broad daylight. And never give in to fear. I come from a small town in Pennsylvania, and I've lived here all of my life. I'm 17 years old, and the time this story took place, I was around 14 years old. My memory around this is a little hazy because I don't like to talk about it, but I figured I'd let out any dark feelings I still get by it. It may not be considered a scary story, but to me, this was probably one of the most scariest things that I've ever been through. At the time this happened, I was an 8th grader in middle school. During the time, my mom worked at Panera Bread, and she had to work very early in the morning, so me and my sister would usually take the bus to school while my dad and my little brother, who was around 4 years old at the time, would stay home. This will be important later. It was like any other ordinary day. Me and my sister would get ready and leave it around 7:20 a.m. to walk to our bus stop. We lived in an apartment complex, and we would have to walk the 3 minutes to the front of the apartment because that's where the bus would pick us up. A little background information: me and my sister would meet up with our friends at the bus stop since we lived in the same apartment complex, and we would wait until the bus showed up. I would stay at the back with my friend, while my sister and her friend would be towards the front, 5 feet from the stop. So, like our usual routine, I had met up with my friend, Reed, and my sister would meet up with her friend, who I'll call Lelia. We waited for the bus to show up. Me and Reed would always see this boy, who I'll refer to as Scott. He was a year younger than us, and he would always run across the street to our bus stop to get a seat since we would be the first to be picked up. This was because by the time the bus driver would pick him up, he'd be the last person, and there would be no seats left for him to sit at. So he began to run across the street, and we were used to seeing him run across like that. Reed and I would always laugh at the way he ran, but wouldn't pay any more attention after he made it across. This will also be important. So, as we're waiting for the bus to arrive, me and my friend were talking, and there would be 5 other kids waiting for the bus at the front of the apartments as well. And like always, we see Scott across the street, waiting for the bus to arrive. A few minutes go by, and we see the yellow bus coming towards our stop. So everyone on our side begins to gather their belongings, and we begin to form a line as the bus gets closer. It begins to blink its lights, and the stop sign starts to come out at the side, as a sign for the other cars to stop. And for just a second, I begin to see Scott running across. I don't give it 2 thoughts since this was normal, and I began to hear the screeching noise coming from the opposite side of the road. It was like everything was going in slow motion during those couple of seconds, and I remember hearing the screeching noise become louder and louder. As I'm picking up my head to see what the noise was, I heard a big thump noise, and what I saw next will forever remain in my mind until this day. I hear a big thump noise, and I then see Scott flying in the air. I then see Scott hitting the ground so hard, and the noise was so loud as he then made an impact to the street. I remember hearing my friend Reed then scream at the top of her lungs, and I then quickly looked at the car, and I saw the driver inside. I remember seeing the bus driver quickly taking out his walkie-talkie attached to his radio as he was then saying all these codes into it. I then see Scott running around the bus and towards where our bus stop was, and he then had his arms wrapped around his stomach, and he was bleeding all around his head. He also had these cuts on his face, and he was crying wildly. During that moment, I was so horrified that I froze, and I was so scared to say anything. The driver then came out of the car and began to panic, then sang to Scott, "Oh my God, man, I'm so sorry. I never even saw you." I was looking down for 1 second, and then it just happened. But Scott was in so much pain, then he didn't even pay attention to him. Then this kid in my sister's grade ran up to him, then sang, "Hey, man, do you need an ambulance?" Scott was just crying, then shaking his head yes. The boy then took out his phone and called 911, telling the operator everything that happened. The driver then fell to the ground, took a cell phone out, and began to call someone. He then put it on speaker, and once the person picked up and said hello, he'd been sad, "Mom," to the kid, "So sorry." And he then began to break down in tears, and he just kept repeating that same line over and over again. The driver's mother had tried to calm him down, and then the driver just said, "Please forgive me, please. And even my car, it's a friend's car." Scott just stayed on the ground, lying there, as everyone watched him. The next thing I remember was that Scott always had his mother and brother take him to the bus stop, and they would always make sure he got on, but on this day, they never went with him to the bus stop. I then began to check on my sister, making sure she was okay. Her and her friends seemed a little shaken up, but they were okay. Reed's mom and sister were running up to us, and I remember hugging them. At that moment, I felt so alone and horrified. I began to cry hysterically, and my sister was just trying to comfort me. Something that I always regret was never telling my parents right away about what happened. I didn't want to wake and worry my dad, and I didn't want to get my mom in trouble for leaving early. I knew that she suffered from anxiety, so I didn't want to give her a panic attack, which she would get every once in a while. So, my sister and I just decided to wait there. I remember calling my friend, who I'll call Kara. I remember that her and her mom worked at the school next to ours, and I began to tell her everything that happened. I began to break down. They quickly alerted the front desk, and she calmed me down, telling me everything was going to be okay. I know some of you might be thinking, how was I able to call my friend but not my parents? But during that moment, I just felt the need to call Cindy because she was who I trusted at the time, and we're still friends to this day. About 20 minutes later, the ambulance arrived. They began to check Scott and treat him while he was lying on the ground, still crying and in pain. 10 minutes passed, and I began to come at ease. They started to place him on the stretcher. I remember seeing his mom and brother running with a paramedic towards him, and they had the most worried and horrified faces that I've ever seen. I began to feel so sad for them. Reed, my sister, and I thought it would be okay if we went to school just to try and take our minds off of everything that happened and all of the horror we witnessed 40 minutes ago. We were at our bus stop for almost an hour, and we still got picked up at the next stop and then immediately went to school. I remember the staff waiting there for us and separating the apartment complex bus stop kids, escorting us to the library. I won't go into too much detail, but they pretty much stated that we could stop by the counselor's office anytime during the school day, and if we wanted to leave school, we were able to. After that event, I didn't take the bus for 4 months and was dropped off. I didn't want to cross the street, and whenever I would hear a tire screech, I would always jump and begin to get a cold sweat. A few months later, I began to feel better and continued to live a normal life. After that, Scott didn't go to school until months later, until he was finally okay, towards the end of the year. Like I said, I know this wasn't the typical stalker story, but this was one horrific event that I went through, and I never want to go through it again. But remember to stay safe out there. I really hope many people don't ever have to witness what I and the other kids had to see that day. It was truly awful. New York City trains are pretty crazy. I've been groped and harassed, and I've seen things that I don't ever want to see again. My best friend and I were neighbors living in Upper Manhattan. It was summertime, and it was pretty late. It was around 8:30-ish, and we wanted to go to the west side to get some milkshakes because we always liked to go out late for little adventures. Of course, my parents didn't want us to go out late, but we kept pushing it, and we ended up going. In order to get to where we wanted to go, we had to take the subway. As we're coming back, it was already 9:30-ish, so we expected to get back home around 10. The train arrived, and my best friend and I hopped in. The train car was empty, so we sat on the chairs with 2 seats. As we arrived at the next stop, a man came into the same car. We didn't think anything of it until the man sat right across from us. Keep in mind, the train car was nearly empty, and he could have picked literally any other seat but decided to sit across from us. Of course, my friend and I thought that was weird, so we texted each other saying we were going to move to the next car when we got to the next stop. As we were heading to the next stop, we quickly ran out of the train and ran to a different car. We just kind of laughed it off until our smiles slowly turned into worried faces when we saw the same man coming into the new car we had just moved to. Obviously, my friend and I felt completely uncomfortable. We moved all the way down to the opposite end of the car, and the man did the same exact thing. Keep in mind, the man himself didn't look creepy. He looked pretty average, which honestly made me really surprised. But my friend and I quickly moved to the next car once we got to the next stop. We were pretty scared because we were only 15 years old, and we were females on a subway. Train going back home alone around 10 o'clock. I don't really remember how we lost the man, but luckily we did. We quickly ran back home after we got off our stop, also making sure we weren't being followed. We didn't tell our parents because we knew they wouldn't let us out again, so we just kept it to ourselves. Nothing crazy like this ever happened again to us, but now we know to be more careful taking the subway home. For anyone that comes to New York and takes the subway, please be careful because you really never know who's gonna follow you. I'm a student in Rome and I live about 2 hours away from it, so whenever I have to go there, I have to go by train. I do have my driver's license, but I prefer the train because I can study on the way there. Plus, in Italy, it's quite common for students to move by train to reach the cities where we study. So, this one day in question, I was waiting at the train station in Roma Tiburtina with my boyfriend for my train to come. This is one of those times where I would get on the train by myself because he had an extra lesson the following day, so he was just keeping me company. We both noticed a weird guy with a bike acting strange, like he was drunk or something, but we didn't pay much attention because the station is often full of drunk homeless people roaming around. Here's why he never lets me go alone to the station, especially at night. So, we sat and waited for my train, and when it finally arrived, I got up, kissed my boyfriend goodbye, and got on the train. I did notice the guy with the bike standing in line behind me to get on the train, but I honestly didn't give it that much thought. After all, lots of people took my same train, and there were often drunk people trying to board without a ticket. When I got on the train, it was packed. No matter how many carriages I passed, I couldn't find a seat, so I just sighed and decided to go sit by the train door. I don't know about other countries, but here in Italy, some trains have a little seat by the door that you can unfold. So, I unfolded one of those and sat there, taking out my history book and starting my long study session. About 5 minutes into my studying, I felt something on my cheek. It was a hand. I raised my gaze from my book, and there he was, the guy with the bike. I immediately jerked his hand away from my face and asked, who are you and what do you want? He simply just stood there smiling, so I asked again, who are you? He then looked me dead in the eyes, still with that creepy grin, and said, I'm no one. I'm just a dude. Wanna have some fun? I didn't even bother answering. I just started picking up my stuff to leave, but then he put his arm right in front of me, blocking my way into the carriage. So, I grabbed his wrist, dug my nails into it, and then jerked it away, freeing my passage to the much more crowded carriage where he couldn't do anything to me. I tried to look for the ticket inspector to get some help, but he just kept following me. One very kind man noticed the creep was following me, so he offered me a seat and told me to stay there while he went to look for the inspector. I sat down and waited. I honestly thought that I was safe, that he wouldn't try to do anything in front of so many people, but I was wrong. He started going back and forth along the corridor of the carriage, and every time he passed me, he would try to touch me. He would caress my shoulder or face or even try to go to my breasts, despite the fact that I kept jerking his hands away. Everybody just watched and said nothing, absolutely nothing, to help me. After a while, the man came back with the ticket inspector and the creep ran away in the opposite direction. The inspector came up to me, and I showed him a picture of the dude that I'd managed to take, telling him that he was following me and touching me. So, the inspector went after the creep and eventually caught him a few carriages forward. He then proceeded to call the police. The police came to the next station, and while waiting, the creep was placed near his bike by the door with the inspector constantly watching him. At the train station, 2 officers had to literally lift him out of the train because he was resisting, saying that we were friends and that I obviously liked his attention. But he got arrested anyway. And the worst part of all this, no one even dared to help me on that train when he was trying to touch me in front of everyone. There was even a woman who said I must have done something to turn him on. So, even though I was just a student minding my own business, just sitting there looking at my books, in her mind, I must have done something to turn him on. Still to this day, I can't believe I was the one being blamed for his creepy behavior. Seriously, what the? My name is Maury. I'm from the USA. Years ago, I worked in a home for older people as a nurse. I had the night shift. We were together drinking coffee on the second floor. All of a sudden, we heard a loud bang, so we thought a client had fallen. We decided that I would take the second floor and my colleague would take the first. Maybe we could find out what happened. While my colleague walked down the stairs, I looked at the monitor, which was on the second floor, and I saw someone in the department on the ground floor. He was inside the closed apartment. You could walk in over there, but you needed a code to get out. People with dementia lived there. We watched for a while, and the guy was stuck, he couldn't get out. We decided to go inside a room on the second floor of one of our clients because you needed a special key to go inside. We thought that was safer. We explained to her what was going on. She was perfectly capable of understanding the situation, and of course, we called 112. I explained the situation, and they told me they would come right away. I called my husband, who also had the night shift as a security guard in another town not too far away from us. He was just talking with the cops while I called 112 and said they were on their way. When I hung up, I looked outside and saw that guy climbing out the window. So I called back. They asked if something had changed. The police arrived, and we did a walk with them throughout the whole building. The guy broke the door in the kitchen. His stuff to break the door was there on the ground. The police couldn't really do much. I don't even know if they found the guy. Later that day, we heard that they were riding around the building 2 hours before the guy went in, and the guy had walked all over the ground floor, all while we were having our coffee on the second floor. That's a pretty scary thought. The next day, I had one more night shift. Though I don't have that much to fear, it was still pretty scary. So I asked if I could bring my 2 dogs. We had 2 golden at the time, and they were actually okay with that. So I brought them with me the next night. Nothing happened. The dogs walked with me the whole night, and of course, I let them outside now and then to do their thing. The other night, 2 other colleagues had the night shift, and guess what? They came back. They had robbed the safe. I always thought that the guy we had was just looking around to see if he could get away, but they had planned to come back for the safe the next night. But I'm guessing the 2 golden scared them off. I wouldn't go inside if there were 2 dogs like that either if I didn't know them. Later on, I always brought my dogs if I ever did the night shift over there. Most colleagues would be happy if they worked with me because they felt safe with the dogs, and so did I. The funny thing was that the dogs knew the route we always walked. After a few times, I didn't even put their leash on, they just knew. If we needed to help a client, they just waited in the hallway until I was done. A few clients knew it because I told them, knowing that they loved dogs. So when they needed our help, the dogs went with us in their apartment. Both the dogs and clients loved that. I'm 18 years old and going to be a freshman in college this September. This past July, my friend Zelda held a pool party in her backyard as a sort of graduation party, minus any of her family being around because her parents were away. She often has the house to herself, so her parents' house is the go-to spot for a lot of hangouts. She invited like 100 people from our grade. There had to be upwards of 150 people there at the night's peak. I was one of the first to show up with my friend Jonah because we're close with Zelda, so we wanted to help out a little bit. By the time people started showing up, everyone congregated slowly from the kitchen and living room to outside in the backyard by the pool. Some people brought their bathing suits and jumped into the pool, others just jumped in their underwear, and then, of course, most others just stood around the pool. She has a huge backyard. At a certain point, so many people were at the party that it was clear as day people were bringing friends from other schools because we didn't know everyone there. Zelda was getting mad because she made it clear she didn't want randoms. In fact, unfamiliar people seemed to be just barging through the gate, not even accompanied by people from our school or grade. There wasn't much we could do, though. The party was already too crazy to easily control. Zelda did throw in our class group chat not to bring any more randoms or they'd be asked to leave. The problem seemed to slow down after that. At around 1 a.m., the police came to the house and had to shut down the party due to multiple complaints from neighbors, so the music was turned off, and 99% of the guests were asked to leave. Mostly everyone cleared out except a few close friends, including some of Zelda's girlfriends, Letitia and I, and a few other guy friends. We helped do some cleaning, like picking up all the empty cans and bottles. Eventually, it was just 4 of us left there. I'm talking at like 3 a.m., if not later. Since it was hot outside, we migrated to the inside of the house in the air conditioning, where we were just chilling in the living room, continuing to drink. Then we all heard a distinct crack from upstairs, and we went silent. Zelda was the first to ask what was that as we all looked at each other with these wide-eyed, half-laughing, half-freaked-out faces. Letitia and I left, teasing Zelda that someone was upstairs in her room, and she begged us to stop and check it out, so we did. We went upstairs to Zelda's room. It was clear. We then went to the guest room that used to be her older brother's room, and we found one of our friends, Eudora, passed out in the bed. We went downstairs to tell her that Eudora was upstairs and knocked out. I guess that gave her a sigh of relief. Looking back, that didn't much explain a sound coming from upstairs if he was knocked out in bed, though, but we weren't exactly the most coherent at that moment. Eventually, Zelda and her friend Mia went to sleep in her room, Letitia fell asleep on the couch, and I went to her parents' bed. None of us were okay to drive anywhere. I can't remember how much time passed before I remember one of the girls screaming in the next room over, and then both of them. It was a heart-dropping kind of moment, but I didn't know if they were messing around with each other at first or not, but I realized pretty quickly the screams were way too real. I burst out of the bed and went to Zelda's room and opened the door. The lights were out. I could barely see anything except for the 2 girls huddled up, hugging each other in the corner of the room, basically curled up on the floor. I saw what they were screaming at. There was a tall person in the opposite corner of the room, on the other side of the bed from them. I saw him looking at me in the doorway. I yelled at the girls to run, and they did. There was so much yelling that even Eudora woke up and came out as the girls ran downstairs, screaming that the man was touching their feet. We followed, but looking back with 3 guys there, we regrettably didn't try to overpower that one man. We all left the house, and one of us called the police, waiting by the neighbor's house with the neighbors, possibly the same ones who called the cops on the party. We didn't see the man leave the front door ever, and after police searched the house and couldn't find him, that meant he left through the back door. None of us recognized who that man was. It was probably an older man who knew Zelda somehow that snuck into the house during the commotion of the party and thought Zelda would be alone after the party. It's some sick, scary stuff. Whether we could have overpowered him or not, we'll never know because we don't know if he was armed.